incredibly honored to be asked to participate. And I was also thrilled to be part of celebrating 100 years. I mean, that's pretty extraordinary.
I'm always kind of tripped out that this even gets to be sort of my life and career, and that I've spent 99% of it in this house. And so I'm grateful for that.
It's such an honor, and it's such a great opportunity to be around all these other creative people. The camaraderie is a great joy for me.
There are so many legendary, amazing writers who are part of that Simon & Schuster family and who are here tonight celebrating.
Good evening, and welcome to Author, a Simon & Schuster Centennial celebration. Please welcome world-renowned historian Doris Kearns Goodwin.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. I am so glad to welcome everyone to Simon & Schuster's Centennial celebration. And what stagecraft the planners have fashioned for us on this day of commemoration. They somehow managed to get the heavens above to mark the occasion by providing a total solar eclipse this afternoon. So they've set a spectacular tone for our grand family reunion tonight. Here on Earth, down below the heavens, it has been so much fun for me to absorb the storied history of the Simon & Schuster family, to learn of the unlikely genesis that sprang from two young Columbia University graduates, Richard Simon, a piano salesman, and Max Schuster, an arts and culture columnist. The two friends were united by a dream to establish a publishing house that would sell better books to more people at lower prices. No books, they pledged, would bear their name that they had not read, and they were not proud to stand behind. When they opened their doors on 57th Street on January 3rd, 1924, however, they had only one employee, a stenographer, and only one book on their spring list, a book of crossword puzzles. Now, crosswords in newspapers were all the rage at the time, and this was the first book to put together a series of puzzles. They had a first printing of 3,600 copies, $1.25 for each copy, and it included an eraser-capped pencil. But shortly before publication, Richard and Max began to have cold feet, fearful that their first offspring might make it seem that they were publishers of activity books and make it difficult for them to attract novels, poetry, and serious works of nonfiction. So they decided to hide the puzzle book under the name of Plaza Publishers in honor of the Plaza Hotel, where they had routinely met week after week to plan this big adventure. But then when the crossword book became a colossal bestseller, selling 100,000 copies in the first few weeks, Richard and Max decided the time had come to acknowledge their illegitimate offspring in an article in Publishers Weekly. The mysterious Plaza Books, they now proudly revealed, was a wholly owned subsidiary of Simon & Schuster. And in that same issue, our enterprising founders announced their first fall list, including 2 novels, 1 biography, 1 book of poetry, and 4 more puzzle books. By the end of 1924, the 5 crossword books had sold 1 million copies, and Richard Simon and Max Schuster were off and running. At which point, Max Schuster, who had admired Abraham Lincoln ever since high school, decided to adopt Lincoln as his middle name and would forever after sign his name M. Lincoln Schuster. So what better threesome could we have as our founding fathers, Richard Simon, Max Schuster, and their silent partner, Abraham Lincoln? It is a mark of how old I am that S&S has been my publishing home for nearly 1/2 of its 100-year history. And oh, wow. And over these nearly 5 decades, S&S never once lost faith in me, as I took an inordinate amount of time to complete each book, twice as long to write about the Civil War and Lincoln's team of rivals as it took the war to be fought, longer than World War II to write about Franklin and Eleanor and the home front. And for these last years, S&S has been at my side on the emotional journey that resulted in the book that will be published next week, An Unfinished Love Story, A Personal History of the 1960s. The idea for the book, oh yeah, you're so great, thank you. The idea for the book sprang one summer morning, several months after my late husband, Dick Goodwin, had turned 80. He came down the stairs, clumps of shaving cream on his ears, singing, "Oh, what a beautiful morning" from the musical Oklahoma. When I asked why he was so chipper, he announced that he had finally decided to open some 300 boxes he had dragged with us through our entire married life, boxes that contained diaries, letters, drafts of historic speeches, memos, and memorabilia from the 1960s, a decade when he seemed to be a Zelig-like figure, present at defining moments with all the major characters, with JFK, Jackie Kennedy, LBJ, Martin Luther King, Eugene McCarthy, and Robert Kennedy. For 40 years, however, Dick had been leery of opening these boxes. The ending of the decade, the escalating war in Vietnam, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, riots in the cities, violence on college campuses, had cast a dark curtain on the entire era for him and for the entire country. Dick wanted only to look ahead. But then at 80, he had finally realized, he told me, if he had any wisdom to dispense, he better start dispensing soon. So we resolved to go through the boxes together in chronological order, reliving the 60s week by week, year by year, suspending knowledge of the end of the story, knowing only what the people at the time knew. Thus began our last great adventure together. In the middle of our project, Dick was diagnosed with a cancer that eventually took his life. Throughout his illness, however, the prospect of the book kept him anchored. It gave him a sense of purpose. I realize now we were both in the grip of a fantasy, maintaining the enchanted thought that so long as we were working on the project, learning, laughing, exploring the boxes, his life, my life, our lives together would not be finished. If a talisman is an object thought to have a magical power and to bring luck, the book was our talisman. I've often called the subjects of my books, Abraham Lincoln, both Roosevelt's and LBJ, my guys, because I've spent so many decades immersing myself in their letters, diaries, and memoirs, waking up with them in the morning, thinking about them when I go to bed at night. I would often talk with them. I would continually ask them questions, but sadly, they never once answered. But now, my guy is my husband, sitting across the room from me, arguing with me, correcting me, laughing, as we read aloud from his letters, diaries, and documents. When Dick died, I felt the weight and the responsibility of the project we had begun together. In the months of grief and dislocation that followed, it was always on my mind. It began to evolve from a memoir I was helping him to write to a joint memoir as I explored my own experiences in the 60s, and then to something larger as I reached out to interview and hear stories from a chorus of voices that had witnessed and helped shape a generation. The importance of telling stories from previous generations was the core of an address Abraham Lincoln delivered when he was 28 years old. He was troubled by the temper of the country in the 1830s, a tendency to substitute passion for judgment, to engage in mob action in disregard of the laws of the land. In such unsettled times, he cautioned, a dictator might arise. He worried that with the passage of some 60 years since the American Revolution and the ratification of the Constitution, the living history of that time, the vivid and visceral experiences once found in every family, was fading, along with the founding generation itself. To restore that state of communal feeling so essential to democracy, the stories of the revolution and the founding of our nation, he said, must be told and retold, read and recounted. Lincoln's words took on a powerful resonance in my mind as I realized that in a similar way, some 60 years after memories of the upheavals of the 60s have begun to fade, be half forgotten or become misunderstood, my project with Dick might add our voices, along with a chorus of firsthand participants and witnesses, to the task of restoring a living history of that pivotal decade, allowing us to see what opportunities were seized, what mistakes were made, and what light might be cast on our own fractured time. More and more I realized that memories of violence and riots that set whole cities ablaze had obscured the greatest illumination of the 60s, the exhilarating conviction that individuals could make a difference, the impulse that stirred tens of thousands of young people to join the Peace Corps, to participate in sit-ins and freedom rides, to march and demonstrate against segregation and the denial of the vote, and to launch the women's movement and the gay rights movement for freedom, equality, and justice. And when the conscience of the country was fired, long-established systems of discrimination began to tumble. Oh, how we need a return of that fighting spirit today. But as I come to an end, let me return for a moment to where I began, to young Richard Simon and Max Schuster, and the choice they made at the birth of Simon & Schuster to adopt as their logo the figure of a man spreading seeds from a painting by Jean-Francois Millet. This original emblem of the seed sower was a metaphor for the enduring power of books to plant seeds of inspiration, imagination, courage, humor, entertainment, empathy, and resilience, and yes, a reverence for facts, a reverence for truth, and a reverence for knowledge, the very qualities of mind and spirit we so badly need to begin the process of healing our beleaguered country today. So in that spirit, let our celebration begin.
And now, please give a warm welcome to the President and CEO of Simon & Schuster, Jonathan Karp.
Good evening. Working with Doris and reading her manuscript as it came in chapter by chapter has been one of the greatest experiences of my time at Simon & Schuster, and I hope you will all read her new book, which confirms why Doris has been called America's historian-in-chief. The 35 authors on tonight's program convey the luminous literary sweep of our list, and we are going to do our best to keep the action moving as fast as we can. To celebrate a century of Simon & Schuster, our authors will share a personal story about an experience, a person, an idea, or a book that was especially formative and meaningful in their lives as readers and as writers. We wanted to give you some humor up front, so we've invited an author who follows in the tradition of many of the comedians that we've published for 100 years. From Eddie Cantor, Groucho Marx, and Bob Hope, to Gilda Radner, Carol Burnett, and Amy Schumer. For pure laugh-out-loud humor, the funniest book that I've ever worked on is a bestseller called Is This Anything? And it is my pleasure to welcome the author, one of the greatest comedians of all time, Jerry Seinfeld. All right.
Worst possible way to introduce a comedian. You just heard it. That is the worst thing. It's actually hostile to say that, actually. But how about Schuster? So pissed that he got second billing, he jams Lincoln into his name in the middle of his life, going, well, if it's going to be Ann Schuster, I'm going to be Lincoln. I'll be Lincoln.
All right. Now, I understand that there was a book that sort of helped you, inspired you to become a comedian, that you read when you were young?
There was a book called The Last Laugh by Phil Berger. We talked about it. What about it?
Did it? How did it inspire you?
Well, it was the first book ever written just about this profession. Nobody had ever just tried to look at the profession, talk to the people that were doing it, and write about it. So, because, you know, when I was a kid watching comedians on TV, I literally didn't know how they said funny things. I thought maybe that they talk like this all the time. I didn't know that these are jokes that they figured out and practiced. I thought they just talk like that.
Okay.
But that was, you know, I was like 15, and then I had to figure out what they were doing.
All right, and I noticed when I was reading your manuscript when it first came in that a lot of your earliest bits seem to have been inspired by breakfast cereal.
Mm-hmm, yes.
And my favorite bit about the breakfast cereal was the bit about life. And I was just wondering...
Life cereal, yes.
Can you talk about the inspiration behind that?
Well, the inspiration is getting a laugh for your act. That's the inspiration. But it's just, you know, one of those things, you know, comedy is like looking at things that second time. You think, well, life, you know, I could see that's a big word. That's a big title. Okay, the magazine, Life magazine. Okay, fine. This is a cereal, and we're going to call it life. I thought, what were the other? How about Odies or squares? Oh no, this is much big. This is life, I tell you. My kids love that joke, by the way.
It's a good joke. And you've sort of stayed on the breakfast cereal track. I guess you have.
I did a couple other things, but but I returned to it. Yes.
Yes, I'm trying to help you promote an upcoming
Thank you very much.
project.
You're going to really turn the tide with this
Okay.
promotion. This is going to make all the difference.
It's premiering on Netflix on
Yeah.
May 3rd. Would you like to tell them what it is, or would you rather just
Okay,
assume
so I made a movie about how Kellogg's invented the Pop-Tart. It's called Unfrosted, and it's not like Barbie. Barbie was made by Mattel. Kellogg's did not even know we were doing this. I got a very flimsy cover letter from a shady lawyer in the Valley. I showed it to Netflix and I said, oh, we're completely legally allowed to do this. We'll take all their products, all their IP, all their characters. It'll be fine. And 3 weeks ago, we told them that we made this. And they actually were pretty good about it.
As they should.
Yeah.
So you told me that you actually got a lot of your ideas for these food-related bits from walking around through markets after you did your earliest shows.
Yes, I wasn't a drinker or a drug person, so after doing shows, comedians, we got to do something after the show, and I would go to supermarkets because they were so brightly lit, and there were so many things to look at, and so that's what I would do.
All right.
So I had a lot of food bits.
All right. Now, something else you've talked about is you didn't really, you weren't always so eager to write books, I think, because you like the audience. And yet for your audiobook for Is This Anything, you recorded it all by yourself without an audience in the midst of the pandemic.
Yeah.
I was wondering how that experience was for you.
Slow. Slow and quiet and just like marching through sand at the end of a bad day at the beach. Just trudging back to the car. That's what it was like. Thank you, John.
We're living all those happy memories.
I mean, doing comedy to dead silence. Oh God, it was just horrible. And I don't know if people liked it. I can't imagine that they would. But you make people do this. You say everyone does this. You have to do it. So I did it.
All right, and I guess finally I would sort of like to ask you, how has your writing evolved through the years? How have you changed as a writer, or how has your process changed?
The process is the same. I enjoy it more. I don't have to force myself so much. I realize this is really the only thing of value that I do. And I used to do it because I had to do it because comedians, if you don't create new material, you die. You have to do that to survive. So it was just something I would just force myself to do. And then after many, many years, I started to actually enjoy it. Now I really enjoy it a lot. But you inviting me to do the book was the only time I ever stopped and thought, well, gee, what happened to me? How did I go from a kid in my room just wanting to do this thing that to me was like being an astronaut or a baseball player, and then I became that thing? How did that happen? And because you invited me to do the book, it forced me to stop and reflect on that, and that was a great experience, and I thank you for encouraging me to do it.
Well, thank you for writing the book.
Yeah.
You once said that that you kind of thought of yourself like as a singer-songwriter.
Mm-hmm.
That comedian, and people forget that before he does the stand-up, it's all written and meticulously crafted. And as his editor, I can tell you that you were revising bits that were decades old, right up to the time we published.
Yeah, I just like to play with them. They're just Legos. Words. A good writer, words are Legos. They're toys to play with.
Well, thank you for playing with us, Jerry. It is an honor to be your publisher. And Jerry Seinfeld.
Thanks, John. Thank you. Thank you.
Introducing acclaimed novelist, essayist, critic, poet, and playwright, Colm Tóibín.
In Ireland, because there's so many good poets, I think bad poets are generally not invited to parties or not welcome anywhere they go. And there's a general feeling, I think, that bad poets should write prose. And that's one of the reasons why I became a novelist. But there's another more important reason. In Ireland, it's also the case, because we have so many good barmen and famous barmen and bartenders, then bad barmen are really hard despised and they're not welcome. And I was a bad barman. And it all began when I was 16. I got a summer job in the Grand Hotel in Tramore on the south coast of Ireland. And it began badly, my time as a barman, and it never improved. You see, I had no idea how to pull a pint of Guinness. And even when I learned, I still had no idea. And, you know, it sort of went like this, that you were meant to pull it this way, and then this way, and then I wasn't sure, maybe this way back, but only less so, maybe a bit. Or maybe, you know, maybe it was the other way around, that you did it this way, and then this way. I mean, some nights that summer, the ballroom of the hotel was packed with people. The bar was open until 2 in the morning, and the customers, the drinkers, pushed past each other to get my attention. And they wanted things like 1 vodka and tonic, 1 vodka and 1 gin without ice, 2 pints of Guinness, 2 pints of Harp, lemonade. And they looked at me like it was urgent, you know. And the problem was that by the time that I remembered the order, I had forgotten it, you know. So I'd also actually forgotten the face of the person who ordered, you know. So, I mean, the best thing, really, the only solution I felt at the time was to get loads of different types of drinks and mixers and ice and things, lemon, put them on the counter in a row and hope that someone would claim them, and then try and work out how much the order cost. And if you want to know, did things get worse? Oh, they got worse. One afternoon, early in my stay, I noticed that 2 men were in deep conversation. Since there was not much else to do, I decided to listen into what they were saying. And this might have been taken as an incipient example of a novelist, you know, listening into people. But just then it might have also been understood as a sign of pure nosiness on the part of a bad barman. So I hovered close, the 2 men whispered more. It was about money. They were talking about money. I was all ears. The father-in-law, the cash, he scooped it up. No, the wife, no, she never knew. And then suddenly, in the middle of this, the one man looked up at me and said, "Would you ever shag off, you little squirt, whoever you are, and mind your own business?" The next day, luckily for everyone, I had the afternoon off. It was a glorious day, windless, with a high sky. And since I had packed 1 book, I thought I would carry it with me. I might even read it. It was called The Essential Hemingway, and it included the full text of Ernest Hemingway's first novel, The Sun Also Rises, which was published under the umbrella of Simon & Schuster. And it's here. We want to celebrate Hemingway because that book, that afternoon, it hit something. It hit the nervous system before it hit anything else. And it was like energy. It was like electricity. Hemingway's sentences were simple, filled with repetitions and odd variations, filled with an emotion which seemed to live in the space between the words. And I was no longer a bad barman. I was no longer a bad poet. I was living in a book. And that book opened up possibilities. Within 4 years, I would myself be living in Spain, as the characters in that novel do. Within a few years more, I had a typewriter and I had an idea. I was still a bad poet. I was still a bad barman. But now I could find a way to subsume all that failure into style. I would start to write fiction. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage the #1 New York Times best-selling author of 23 novels, Brad Thor.
Wow, thank you very much. This is a lot of fun to follow Jerry Seinfeld and an Irishman and be expected to tell my story in 4 minutes, 3 minutes, 51 seconds. This is great because the last time I was asked by Simon & Schuster to say anything, it was for a former bigwig CEO, and they said, say something nice, maybe something people don't know about him. And I said, he's the fastest guy in publishing. He's the only person I know who can leave Midtown at 5 o'clock on a Friday and be in the Hamptons by 3:30. Not knowing he had a reputation, maybe, for sneaking out a little early on the weekends. In my family growing up, the arts were something to make you better rounded. They were not a career path. My dad had begun his life as a young adult in the Marine Corps, and my mom was a flight attendant for TWA in the 60s, the glamour days of air travel, and she lived at 515 East 88th. And I think it's kind of neat to be back here with my mom having passed by here a lot when she was a flight attendant back in the 60s. And the dream in my family was I would go to school, study business administration, and take over the family business. And I hated it. And I took something called the Strong-Campbell personality test in college, and it said you are scoring off the charts for writing and publishing. So I did something that no American has ever done before. When I graduated college, I took all the money I'd saved and I moved to Paris to write a novel. Had never been done. And I got about 2 chapters into it, and I stopped because I had this little voice that I think we all have in the back of my head saying, what if it's no good? What if you don't find a publisher? What if nobody likes it? And I succumbed to that voice, and I shipped my laptop back home, and I traveled with the money I had made in college. And I came up with an idea for a TV show, and I sold public television on it. It was called Traveling Light. I was the producer, the host, the writer, and it did very well. And during that time, I met my wife. And on our honeymoon, we were in Italy, she asked me, she said, what would you regret on your deathbed never having done? And I said, writing a book and getting it published. And she said, okay, when we get home, you're going to start spending 2 hours protected time every day making that happen. Now, I'd had a title, The Lions of Lucerne, because I'd been to Lucerne, Switzerland to do a show. I didn't know how I was going to work this incredible rock face, this thing that Mark Twain called the most moving piece of rock in the world, this carving to commemorate the Swiss Guard who died in the initial throes of the French Revolution. I said, but someday I'm going to use that title. The last night on our honeymoon that we had an overnight train, it was a shared train compartment. And we were in with a brother and sister from Atlanta, Georgia, and they recognized me from the TV show, and we talked all night about our shared love of books. And the next morning, the sister said, are you going to go make more TV shows? And I said, I'm going to write a novel. And she gave me her business card on the platform and said, I work for Simon & Schuster. If you read that novel, if you write that novel, I would like to read it. And I thought, this is great. I've got a title. I've told my wife I'm going to do it. I met somebody from Simon & Schuster. I just need an idea. We went to the hotel to check in, and the room wasn't ready. And the desk clerk said, if you go around the corner to this cafe, have a sandwich, come back, the room will be done. Cynical Chicagoan that I am, I figured his brother-in-law owned the cafe and that the rooms are never ready on time, and he sends everybody over there for a coffee and a sandwich. On the table next to me was an English language newspaper. I picked it up, and inside I found an article about a Swiss intelligence officer who had embezzled all this money from the Swiss government and was training his own shadow militia high in the Alps with high-tech weapons from his own private arsenal. That became The Lions of Lucerne. I'm now in my 24th book with Simon & Schuster. It's been my family the whole time. I hope you have a lovely night tonight. And happy anniversary, Simon & Schuster. Thank you all for coming.
Please welcome the celebrated host of The Breakfast Club, Charlemagne the God, and the legendary author of more than 25 iconic, beloved novels, Judy Blume.
Peace, 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 peace. In case you're wondering, my name is Judy Blume. Hello.
And I'm Charlemagne the God.
That's right. We're here to talk about just things people told us we couldn't do, Miss Blume.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Miss Judy. She don't like when I call her Miss Blume.
No, I don't. Yeah. I don't.
So what are some things people have told you that you couldn't do in your life?
Well, the first thing was, you might be a nice girl, Judy, but you can't write. And so get out your handkerchief and cry. You have no idea what little children are like. So I got out my handkerchief, and I cried, and then I said, what does he know? It wasn't a publisher, it wasn't an editor. It was somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who wrote books.
Who is that person now so we never listen to them ever again about anything?
I'm sure he's not living. Because this was like 50-something years ago. So,
Absolutely.
But I'm still here.
Yes, that's right. That's right. I was told.
How about you? How about you?
Oh, I was told. I'm always told what I'm not able to do, but I don't listen because one of the greatest things that I was ever told is better to ask for forgiveness than permission. But one thing that I remember vividly was, my cousin, who's really like my aunt because she was like my mom and dad's cousin, but she's like a cousin aunt. I'm from Moncks Corner, South Carolina. It's country, right? And she said to me one time, because I was just, like 17, 18, talking about all these big dreams I had and things that I wanted to do. And she said to me, you shouldn't put your goals so high because if you don't reach them, you're going to be, disappointed. And I remember just thinking like, I should have kept it to myself, but my inside voice became my outside voice. And I was like, that's the stupidest sugar honey iced tea I ever heard in my life. And she was like, no, you're going to be disappointed because you got all of these big dreams. Look where you're from. You're from this small town in South Carolina. You'll never be able to achieve all those things. And luckily, I didn't listen to her.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. My mother used to say to me, just be a good girl, Judy. Just be a good girl. But somehow, I don't know, I outgrew that.
I wonder what was considered a good girl to her.
A good girl was somebody who didn't give her any trouble.
Okay.
Right?
And your books have caused good trouble?
Yeah, they have caused trouble.
Trouble?
Yeah. I mean, there was the first one. So there were two guy principals. The first guy principal was the principal of my kids' elementary school. And, I was really proud when Are You There, God It's Me, Margaret was published. I was so proud. And I signed 3 books, and I gave them to the school library. And the next thing I know, they were gone. And so I asked him, and he said, those books are inappropriate for 5th and 6th grade girls. It's like, wait, 5th and 6th grade girls, some of them already have their periods. And he was like, no.
How would he know?
And the next guy, principal, I'm sorry if any of you are men and you're principals, but this was a long time ago. Things have changed, I hope, except the books are still banned. But the next guy principal, it was about Deanie, and Deanie touched her special place.
She's the reason I don't go into my daughter's room for any reason without knocking. Because it's right now.
He's got 4 daughters, he knows.
That's right.
And he said to me, if it was about a boy, it would be normal. What?
Yikes. Thanks. Yeah, another thing people told me that I couldn't do because my mother was a English teacher. She still teaches sometimes in Moncks Corner, South Carolina, and so she would always tell me to read books that didn't pertain to me. And so we had the Book It program as well. I don't know if y'all remember the Book It program where you read 4 books and you get a free pizza. And so, I don't just look like a Ninja Turtle. I used to really like pizza back then too, and so. I would go in the library and look for books that don't necessarily pertain to me, and that's how I started reading so much Beverly Cleary and Miss Judy Blume. And I remember people telling me I couldn't read those books because I was a young black male from Moncks Corner, South Carolina, and I'm like, it's great storytelling. I like Judy Blume the same way I like Jay-Z. Like, they're the same type of storyteller. I'm serious. Like, a good storyteller is a great storyteller. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Anything else?
Well, there's more sex. So I wrote Forever. There's always more sex.
There's always more sex.
So I wrote Forever.
Okay.
And I was told, you cannot do this. You cannot let a young woman enjoy her sexuality.
We're all here because a young woman enjoyed their sexuality. That's why we're here.
And I live in Key West, which happens to be, even though we deny it, in the state of Florida.
Mm-hmm.
That book is banned in the state of Florida
Wow.
because a young woman enjoys her sexuality.
Wow.
As the father of daughters, you don't want that to happen.
Well, they're 15.
You want them to.
They're 15, 8, 5, and 2, so I don't want them enjoying. Not at this moment. Judy Blume, ladies and gentlemen. I go by the name of Charlemagne the God. Y'all have a great night.
Charlemagne, my friend
Thank you.
Charlemagne. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Joining us now, please welcome Emmy and Peabody Award-winning journalist Michelle Norris.
What a thrill to be here. What a thrill to come on stage with Charlemagne and Judy Blume. Good evening, everyone. Oh, no. No. Let's do that again. This is an occasion. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Good storytelling is often about fixations. Things that you just can't let go of, something that gets in your mind and it just stays there. Sometimes it's a memory, sometimes it's an aroma, sometimes it's a person, sometimes it's a thing, and the thing that I'm going to talk to you about tonight is a thing that is stuck in my mind. It's a piece of furniture. It's called a sideboard. You know what a sideboard is? It's like a buffet, but a little bit fancier. That thing that sits off to the side when you're having a big event with your family, and the table is too full that all the side dishes won't fit at the table, so some of them go over on the side table. It's where it holds the punch bowl. This is the center of something in my mind because it's the center of a story that I received. You see, I'm a storyteller and a story collector. I run something called the Race Card Project. I collect stories about race and identity in just 6 words. And a 6-word story came to me about a sideboard. And when I heard that story, I couldn't let go of it. Maybe it was because my grandmother in Birmingham, Alabama, had a sideboard that she was so proud of. Wood, it was wooden, it had a marble top, and we used to have to polish the top of it. But the sideboard that this fellow wrote to me about from the Midwest was a sideboard that had been built by slaves. In fact, that was his 6 words. This sideboard is built by slaves. And I received that story, and then it took me a while to get back to him because over time I've collected more than 500,000 stories, so it takes me a while to get back to everybody who's written to me. And all these things stay in my head such that I sometimes don't even know where my keys are because I have so many stories in my head and so many fixations on the things that are in the story, but this one really stuck with me. And so I wrote to him and I said, I want to know more about the sideboard. And he responded and said, it's been destroyed. Huh, yeah. That was my response. I felt like I had been crushed. I was angry. I had to leave the house. I went and took a long walk. I was emotional. I actually shed a few tears over this. And I had to figure out how to call him because I didn't want to confront him. I wasn't going to exactly wag a finger at him, but I kind of was. And I just wanted to know why he would destroy something, because I understood that it might have been difficult for him because of the history, the weight, both the physical weight and the weight of what that represented. But it meant something different, I guess, to me because of the people from whom I am descended, the people who made something like that. And when I finally got him on the phone, he explained, oh, no, it's not actually destroyed. Whew. But he gave it away. He couldn't find someone to take it because it was so big and heavy. He wanted to give it to a museum. Finally, he found someone who was willing to come to his state and take it because they were picking up a bunch of antiques. So they came and they took this thing, which weighed, it was like moving a piano, and took it away and moved it to a warehouse in Kansas. It was an antiques dealer took it. And as we talked, he explained to me why he just couldn't have it in his home. He's descended from people who once owned people. And that sideboard has been moving through a series of consecutive houses, getting smaller along the way. The house that they owned in the South was big, and then a smaller house, and then they moved to the Midwest in a smaller house. And he lives in a very small house, and he said, I didn't have room for this side table, but he also just didn't have room for it in his heart. He explained to me the reasons why, because he knew the history. He knew that it was built by slaves, and he knew why slaves did the building. Because in the part of the South that he was from, They built furniture from live oak, and if any of you have ever worked with wood, you know that live oak is a very, very hard kind of wood. You can cut 3 pine trees with a single saw. I see you nodding your head, you understand this. But it sometimes takes 3 saws to cut through a single trunk of live oak because it is so hard. And because it is so hard, the saw sometimes will fly off another direction. So when you go to a community and you know who was working on wood, because you would see the results of that: lost fingers, maiming, they'd lose arms, they'd have all kinds of cuts about them. So they decided, we're going to let the enslaved do this work because it's just too dangerous. He taught me that, but it turned out I could teach him something also, because in the research I had done, I had learned about people who were enslaved, who built furniture, who also did ironwork, who built the balustrades and some of the architectural elements in the homes that we still live in today. And what I learned is that people who were unable to read and write, not because they lacked the intellect, but because people refused to allow them to learn how to read and write, developed their own language through their craft. Some of the enslaved told stories through the woodworking, through the dental molding, through the way that they carved certain things. They told stories of births and deaths and discoveries, and most likely disappointments. He wanted that piece of furniture destroyed. I couldn't imagine why anyone would want to destroy it. I asked him, why did you tell me that it was destroyed? Because that destroyed me. And he said, because that's what I want to happen in my mind. I want to see it erased. I want to see it crushed. And I just can't understand that. I understand why people want to outrun a history. It's something that's perhaps something we should be thinking about. And it makes me think about another 6-word story that has landed in my inbox. History is a complicated, demanding mistress. She will not be ignored. We know that right now, in the moment that we're living in, we get to choose our future in terms of climate change, in terms of electoral politics, in terms of how we treat each other. But there are a lot of people right now who are also invested in the idea that they get to choose their past. But do they? But should they? All I know is that I will never forget that sideboard. I never got to see it, and yet it's still in my mind. And the dude who lives in the Midwest, who inherited the sideboard but decided to give it away, he can't quite forget about it either. Whenever he calls the person who took it, they struck up a friendship, and he calls and he asks, how's, is it still there? Is it still in the warehouse? It turns out it is still in the warehouse, collecting dust. It's not in a dump yard. It has not yet been destroyed. It's still in the warehouse, but actually, it's kind of still in his house. It's still occupying space in his mind. It's still occupying real estate in my mind, and now that I've told you the story, it might occupy space in your minds also. It's still in the room, and that's kind of like our shared history in America. It's both beautiful and ugly, complicated and sticky, and impossible to outrun. I hope that that fellow in the Midwest changes his mind about wishing that a piece of furniture with that kind of energy would disappear from our earth, that sideboard. That piece of furniture is a little piece of America's history, and that sideboard still has stories to tell. And one of the stories that it has taught me, reminded me as a storyteller and a story collector, is that sometimes we think we are done with stories before they are done with us. Happy anniversary, Simon & Schuster. 100 years sure looks good on you.
Please give a warm welcome to iconic investor and entrepreneur, Ray Dalio.
Whoa, what an honor. To be among such incredible people and incredible writers. And, you know, I'm just a humble investor, so this is quite something. I wonder what we have in common. And listening to all the writers and thinking about my own life experience it strikes me that we all had our different lives that gave us our different stories, and that they ended up being in our books. We are still going through similar life cycles that last around 85 years, give or take about 10 years. They take us through our different phases, from childhood, when we are dependent on others, to adulthood, when we choose our adventures, and others become dependent on us, and to our post-work lives, in which Joseph Campbell said we are free to live and free to die. From my perspective of being 75, looking back on my life, I find it striking of how it was so different than I thought it would be. To me, life's path had a lot more randomly determined events that shaped my life cycle in a way that I never imagined. And my biggest and most painful mistakes and failures were typically my most valuable experiences, because they taught me the most, and I never expected that. I wonder if the same is true for you all and the other authors. I wonder what we have in common. In my case, when I was 12, I caddied for people who invested in stocks, which we talked about when we were walking around on the caddying on the golf course. And the little money that I took, I earned, and I bought stocks. The first stock I bought was bought because it was the only company I ever heard of that was selling for less than $5 a share. I thought I could buy more shares. If it went up, I would make money. It turned out that it was about to go broke, and some company acquired it. It tripled in value, and I was hooked. I thought that this game was easy. The game is anything but easy, but it got me hooked. That experience got me hooked and began my career. I got the bug. In those years that followed, I went to school, college, and graduate school, worked on Wall Street for a couple of years, and then set up my little investment firm. I got married, which taught me that the one who one chooses to be one's closest partner in life is the most important decision one can make. And I was very lucky to choose well. When I was 33, in 1982, I made my biggest mistake that led me to my biggest beneficial change. I calculated that American banks had lent more money to emerging countries than those countries were going to be able to pay back, and that there would be a big debt crisis, which was controversial and got a lot of attention. Sure enough, Mexico defaulted on its debt in August 1982, and a number of countries followed. But the stock market went up rather than down because the Fed lowered its interest rates a lot. And that took me by surprise. I lost money for clients. I went broke. I was so broke that I had to borrow $4,000 from my dad to pay for my family bills. That painful experience was one of the best things that ever happened to me, because it gave me the humility that I needed to balance with my audacity. It taught me how to diversify, to reduce my risks without reducing my returns. And it led me to think about and write down my life and work principles to produce outcomes that I wanted. What I learned and how I changed allowed me and my company then to have decades of good success. That experience created that opportunity, and so much so that in 2008, when I was 59, we anticipated the global financial crisis, and that because we had studied the Great Depression. I thought that that was great. That led to Bridgewater and me getting a lot of attention. Some of the attention was about our culture, radical truthfulness and radical transparency, and included some snarky stuff that wasn't really true, which led me to put my life and work principles online, which were downloaded 3 million times because many people found them helpful. That surprised me. I became a writer. Then Jofi from Simon Schuster called, and he said, "Why don't you make it a book?" And the year that I stepped out of the CEO job, I decided to pass along these principles that had worked for me. And so I put out my first book. 5.5 million copies were sold in 34 languages, and people came up to me, they still come up to me all the time, and they thanked me, which surprised me. And I never expected to write books and to impact people in this way. Now that I'm nearly 75 and in my last phase of life, I emotionally want to and logically need to pass along what I have that might be of value to others. I'm writing what I believe will be my last book, which is about investment and economic principles, and I am very grateful to Simon & Schuster, especially avid reader, to make me an author. Wow. And I wonder what surprises will come next. So thank you all for indulging me, and thank you for Simon & Schuster.
Let's give a big hand to Edgar Award-winning novelist William Kent Kruger.
Well, thanks everyone for being here this evening, and what an honor it is to have been asked to be a part of the Centennial celebration for Simon & Schuster. I am so honored to share the stage with so many illustrious authors. And I got to share this with you. Not 15 minutes ago, Doris Kearns Goodwin showed me the way to the bathroom. That's going to make it into my memoir if I ever write one. So it seems to me we should never underestimate the impact that the stories we read to our children might have on them. Their influence can last a lifetime. That's certainly true for me. A book that was read to me as a child and that was published by Simon & Schuster to this day affects how I approach storytelling. Now, when I do a book event, one of the questions I love to ask an audience is, what was the first book that made a difference in your life? What was the first book that opened you to the power of story? And I get a wide range of responses and often some wonderfully surprising answers. And after I have heard what they have to say, I tell them what that book was for me. Now, it's kind of an odd little book, but I think when I explain it to you, you'll understand its importance to me, particularly in my development as a storyteller. So this is what I say. Back in the early 1940s, Simon & Schuster began putting out a line of books that were meant for very young readers. They were called the Little Golden Books. You all remember the Little Golden Books, right? Yeah. So there was one book in that series that was a particular favorite of mine and my brothers and my sister. It was called The Happy Family. It was one of those books where the title said it all. It was about this impossibly happy family. There was a mother and a father. They had a little boy and a little girl, a cat and a dog. They lived in this nice little suburban tract house, and they drove, I swear to God, a station wagon. You know, in truth, not much happens in the happy family. There's a birthday party that they hold in the backyard, and a little bit later they go for a beach outing. And about the most exciting thing that happens across the course of the story is some ants try to get at the birthday cake in the backyard. Yeah, in terms of what we think of as compelling plot, it's about as insipid as you could get. So, why did my brothers and my sister and I clamor for our father to read that book to us night after night? Well, honestly, if he'd read it the way it was written, we'd have grown tired of it pretty quickly. But my father never did that. He would read the first few lines as they were written on the page, and then he would go off on his own, and God alone knew where we'd end up. So, for example, those ants that try to get at the birthday cake in the backyard, in my father's telling of that tale, those were just regular ants. Those were giant ants. And they weren't just after the birthday cake. They were after the happy family. And that beach outing that they go to later where the waves lap gently against the shoreline. And my father's telling, those became tidal waves, and they swept up the happy family, and the happy family had to fight for their lives. And always one of my favorite parts of the book was the ending. The story as it's written, I believe, ends something like this. And Father turned out the light and said, "Good night, sleep tight, don't let the bedbugs bite." My father never ended the story that way. In his ending, it would go something like this. And Father turned out the light and said, "Good night, sleep tight, don't let the bedbugs bite." But when he came to wake the children in the morning, the bedbugs had gobbled them all up. So what's my point? My point is simply this, that what I learned from my father's reading of that little golden book, or probably more appropriately his non-reading of that little golden book, was that a story once begun can go anywhere. You're limited only by the reach of your own imagination. Thank you very much, and God bless Simon & Schuster.
Joining us all the way from Sweden, international bestseller Fredrik Backman.
Good evening. My name is Fredrik Backman. I am here tonight because my agent said that this would be good for my career. She said I need to learn how to speak in front of people. It will be fun, she said. So I told her that I write books. I spend 8 hours every day locked inside a room with people I have made up. If I was comfortable talking to real people, I would have a real job. But my agent said, you know, just go up there and talk about the life of a writer. And I said, all right. Being a writer is the best way I know how to get paid for being insane. Don't applaud. I only have 4 minutes. Stop. I only have 4 minutes. My brain and I, we are not friends. My brain and I, we are classmates doing a group assignment called Life, and it's not going great. So my agent, upon hearing this, said, which is American for I could have been a lawyer. And then she said, maybe you can talk about how you suffer from creative anxiety, Fredrik. And I said, I don't suffer from creative anxiety. And my agent said, well, everyone around you suffer. So I explained that I don't have creative anxiety. I just have, this is just normal death anxiety. And sometimes I have panic anxiety if I'm in a hurry and I need to have a lot of anxiety all at once. But I don't have creative anxiety. I never get writer's block. And the secret is easy, it's procrastination. I don't want to brag, but I'm very good at procrastination. I'm going to have a writer's block, I just haven't gotten around to it yet. I am so good at procrastination that the only reason that I am here tonight is because I'm supposed to be finishing a book right now. But my anxiety is not creative, my anxiety is Scandinavian, because I am from Sweden. And now in America, Sweden is often confused with Switzerland, but we are very different. In Switzerland, they have chocolate and watches. In Sweden, we have IKEA and depression. Swedish depression is just like American depression, but it's cheaper, and you have to assemble it yourself. And some parts may be missing, so if someone in here is depressed tonight and don't know why, then you might be Scandinavian. Of course, some of you will think that because I am Scandinavian, I must write crime novels, but I find murder to be too much work. So instead, I write novels about characters who could murder someone, but they haven't gotten around to it yet. Now, I wrote this speech on the airplane from Sweden to America, which was great because of the time difference. Americans call that jet lag. I call it a procrastinator's dream. Because Sweden is 6 hours ahead of New York, so I left home Sunday evening, and when I arrived here, it was still Sunday evening. The customs official asked me where I was traveling from, and I answered, the future. So if you hear a strange sound now, that's my agent regretting her career choices. But it's too late now, Ariel. So in conclusion, I am here tonight with all of my anxiety, because I know that in this room there might be someone who is dreaming about writing a book, dreaming of becoming an author. So I am here to tell you that I am obviously an idiot. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I became an author anyway. So you can too. And I hope that one day I will be able to tell my agent that the reason that my next book is not finished yet is because I was busy reading yours. Thank you very much.
Please welcome the best-selling writing duo, Christina Lauren.
Oh my goodness. Wow, this is an amazing space.
So many book lovers.
Right? I don't know anything better than being in a theater full of book nerds. This is the smartest party we have ever been to.
And the best looking. Mm-hmm. And how lucky are we that this is our life? Hello, if you don't know us, I am Christina.
And I am Lauren. And for those of you who don't know us, we are best friends who write romance together as Christina Lauren.
We get asked a lot of questions about co-authoring, like, do you disagree?
Which is code for, do you fight?
Yes. Who writes the sex scenes?
Code for, who is the biggest piglet?
Yes. And what kind of relationship does it take to write and publish over 30 books together?
All of them with Simon & Schuster. Yay! And to answer that question, we have a story.
Oh my God, you guys, it's about feet.
No.
Yes.
Not that story.
Yes. Okay, yes, that story. So here's the scene. It's December, and our friend Laura texts and asks me if I have pics of Lo's feet.
Okay, I'm sorry. You cannot say it like that without context. For context, she was having Christmas ornaments made, and she needed to know the font that I use for the tattoos on my feet.
Yes, yeah, okay. So I didn't have any. I know this is shocking, but I said that I would get them. So I'm sure Laura thought that I was gonna be really stealthy about this. Like maybe I would visit Lo and I would take a few while I was there, or maybe I would ask her kids, but no, I just texted Lo and I said, hey, I need pics of your feet. And did she ask me why? No, what did you say?
I said, okay, just don't post them anywhere.
She said, just don't post them anywhere. And that is why this relationship works. Find somebody you trust not to sell pics of your feet on the internet.
It's true. Anyway, it is enough to know that we are best friends who write together, and we met online, as many people do these days, except in our case, we were writing fan fiction. And this is before fan fiction was cool, you guys. We were writing fan fiction before it was cool. And we were reading each other's stories, and we met in person in 2009 at San Diego Comic-Con.
I think it was really a revelation for us. We have had fangirl souls our entire lives. When we love something, we love it until it asphyxiates.
Figuratively.
Yes, figuratively. And while we had been to conventions before, it was when we met up with other fangirls that we felt in our 30s like we had finally found our people.
Here we had found a community that embraced our obsessive fangirl hearts.
That placed female joy front and center.
That celebrated the fantasy of significance.
Which is why romance is truly such a wonderful place to be. It has its own language, inside jokes, tropes, and rules.
It is a genre that relies on our foremothers like Judy Blume,
Nora Roberts,
Beverly Jenkins,
Lisa Kleypas,
Susan Elizabeth Phillips,
Jackie Collins,
Nalini Singh. Listen, we could go on and on tonight just listing the names of impressive women who have come before us and have built romance into what it is, which is a foundational pillar of publishing.
Yes. At the heart of romance is our promise to the reader that at the end, we will deliver a happily ever after.
And also kissing.
At least kissing.
Of course, that happily ever after includes self-discovery, joy, expression, acceptance, and pleasure. But wrapped in all of that is the scaffold of a stable and supportive community.
Which is precisely what it has given us, a happily ever after.
But in our case, without the kissing.
Yes. Romance novels tell readers that they matter. Their dreams matter, their needs matter, their preferences matter, their mental health matter, their bodies matter.
And these messages are reinforced by the romance community itself because we take our job as a fast-moving and culturally visible genre very seriously.
And you know, romance is often looked at as a genre of fluff and leisure, when in truth it is very hard to write because everyone already knows how it ends. They end up together.
And it is precisely that trust in the happily ever after that allows romance to do some really important work. We can explore topics like gender and sexual identity and body autonomy.
Also, global issues like religion, racial inequality, classism, and mental health, because readers are guaranteed hope at the end.
Is romance a perfect genre? No. Like all of publishing, we need to do a lot more to elevate stories from underrepresented voices. We need to train readers to pick up books that are outside of their own experiences and worldview.
But we are romance's most enthusiastic champions because through these books, authors not only help readers find escape, they learn to ask for what they deserve, to see themselves as enough, and to forge these connections in the real world.
And writing at heart is about connection. So that is a search that romance makes plain. And that's what we're doing tonight here. We are building and joining our community of people who love books.
So thank you for including us, two fangirls who could never have imagined one day we would be here in front of all you smart, good-looking people.
Thank you for letting us into your world and embracing our enthusiasm and our joy and our wonder. You are all the heroes and heroines of your own stories and perfect just the way you are.
Now kiss.
Yay!
Please give a big round of applause to the winner of this year's NBCC Award for Autobiography, Sophia Sinclair.
Hi. Hi, thanks everybody. It's an honor to be here. Everyone's having a good time, endorphins are high, so they sent a poet to really temper the emotions. Somewhere in a small fishing village in Montego Bay, Jamaica, is a young girl whose life and fate seem fixed by poverty. The libraries in her hometown are scarce, and there are no books present in her seaside home. Here, young girls are not encouraged to follow their dreams. Towering on either side of her home are hotels she's forbidden from entering because she is a local. But the kitchen women in the hotels have taken a liking to her and allow her to rummage through the trash heap where the tourists leave their coffee-stained books behind as they return to their far-off worlds. And there, in the pages of a book, this young girl finds hope. In books, she discovers a future where she is possible. She can't leave the confines of this life, but she can escape. This young girl is my mother. She followed her love of literature until it led to me, her first daughter, here on this stage, the unlikeliest dream of all, a poet. When I was 10 years old and a young daughter of Rastafari, I was teased and scorned and cast aside at school because of my dreadlocks and because I was part of the Rastafari faith. I didn't have many friends at school. Even my teachers treated me badly. But I did have one friend, and we spent most of our days together. Then, one day at the end of the school year, she sent a boy with a note for me. I unfurled it alone at my desk, and it said, "Please leave me alone. I don't want to be a friend. I don't want to be friends with a Rasta." Just then, my selfhood withered. My pain, my little hydra, unfurled and did not stop. This was the first time I felt ashamed to be myself. So I decided to barter one pain for another. I saw a rusty nail outside the classroom and I stepped down on it hard, harming myself. I told everyone it was an accident, but my mother somehow knew that it wasn't and saw that I needed help. So while on bed rest, she handed me my first book of poems, and she said she thought it would help me. And she told me that poetry was a thing that had always made her world seem wild and wide and warmer. And then she laughed and she said that was alliteration. I said, "What is alliteration?" And then the damage was done. As she spoke to me about her love of poetry, I slowly began to feel all my hurt evaporate into something else, into wonder. And after my mother left me in my room, I flipped through the poems and I read one of her favorites, which was William Blake's The Tiger. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? I felt those words blaze alive in a way that nothing ever had before. The poem's images prowled the neon jungle of my mind, and in that moment, I was inspired to write my first poem, called The Butterfly, in imitation of Blake. But writing this poem was my first spiritual experience, one of stepping through the veil of this world into another world, and slowly, viscerally, feeling all the hurt that hooked its talons into me, all the pain of my rejection, and that note fade to ash, all burned away to wonder. I knew then that what my mother handed to me that day was gold. My mother, who still recites the words to my poems in the front row of my readings and says, "I just can't believe I have my own personal poet." My mother, who loves books and poetry and literature so much that she gifted its magics to me, her daughter, so sensitive and porous to this world, and she created the unlikeliest poet. I followed the gold thread of her words that day into poetry, into writing my own books. And I knew that as long as I followed that thread wherever it led me, I would always be all right. With language and poetry and literature as my guide, I would always survive. This is the power of books. This is the power of poetry, for opening just a little bit more of the world to girls like my mother, girls like me. And I know now, as long as there is a poem that leaps a flame in my mind, I will always be living in an age of wonder.
Next on stage, pioneering psychologist and best-selling author Angela Duckworth.
So there's a theory of what makes the human mind special, and it goes like this. People are the only creatures on Earth that use words. Language, the theory goes, language is the big breakthrough because it is words that enable people to share ideas. There's no other animal on the planet that does that, not even our closest cousins, the chimpanzees. Now, chimps are very smart, actually. They solve puzzles and they use tools. Chimps can experience compassion and jealousy and joy and even grief. A chimp can watch another chimp get a stick and poke it into a termite hill and fish out a bunch of tasty grubs, and then walk over and use the same trick. Very smart. But what chimpanzees cannot do is tell stories. Now, when a person strings together a few words and makes a sentence, they've magically created a mental movie that any other person can watch. Here's an example. Here's a sentence that many of us have read before. "Where's Papa going with that axe?" Fern asks her mother. Of course, that's E.B. White in the first line of Charlotte's Web. And when you hear that sentence without any effort at all, you start playing a little movie in your head. You see a little girl and her mother, and already you know that Papa was just here, but now he's gone, and Fern wants to know why he strolled by with all things an axe. Now, if you're a writer, you may be thinking, yeah, of course, that's what writers do. They conjure images, they conjure ideas. If you do it right, words conjure emotions too. But as a psychologist, I urge us all to reckon with the miracle of words. "Where's Papa going with that axe?" Fern asks her mother. Just like that, all of us watching the same movie, a movie that E.B. White conjured in his imagination one day a very long time ago. Literally, and here finally, I really mean it literally, we are reading E.B. White's mind. For years after, unlike many of the authors tonight, I have only written one book, and it damn near killed me. This will come as news to exactly 0 writers in this auditorium tonight, but I don't know, it was kind of astonishing to me. By far, writing a book has been the most challenging intellectual exercise of my life. On days when writing was going especially poorly, I would say to my husband, Jason, "This book is shaving years off of my life." Sometimes I would joke that I could feel my telomeres shortening. Okay, now that's gallows humor for scientists. I know some of you got the joke, but for those who did not, telomeres are those little biochemical bookends on your DNA. And each time a cell divides, the telomeres get a little shorter. And when they drop below a certain length, that's when your cell knows it's time to call it quits. So it's probably not true that my telomeres are any shorter. I'm not sure, actually, but it may not be true that my telomeres are shorter for having written a book. It's unlikely I shortened my life expectancy, but God, writing a book is so hard. It sure felt that way. For years afterward, and then, going back to my day job as a professor, I would not admit to anyone, not even myself, that I was glad that I'd done it. But upon reflection this evening, I can declare to all of you that the sacrifices any writer makes to string together words into sentences and stories and books, well, it is worth it. And here's why. A chimpanzee can have a good idea, actually a very good idea, but only by sharing ideas is it possible to achieve cumulative wisdom. When a smart chimp dies, its clever ideas die with it. Toward the end of his life, E.B. White said, "Immortality is to be found between the covers of a book. Truer words were never written." Thank you so much.
Fresh off the set of a new Amazon series based on his best-selling novel, The Terminal List Dark Wolf, Jack Carr.
Time machines exist. They exist in stories. All that is necessary is to open the portal is turning to the first page. You don't even need to buy a book. You can take a trip to your local library, browse the bays, select your title, and settle in to be transported into history. The first stories, told around fires, passed on lessons of battle and of the hunt in an effort to keep the family, the tribe, the community, and even the species alive. We are all here today because our ancestors listened to those stories, heeded their lessons, and in turn, passed them on to the next generation. We all share this connection to the past. We are all here today because of the power of story. The last century has been no different, though the technology has certainly changed. Richard Connell's The Most Dangerous Game, first published 100 years ago in 1924, takes us back to the early decades of the 20th century. Geoffrey Household's Rogue Mail delivers us to the eve of World War II. Thrillers and mysteries of the early to mid-40s are fascinating for how they dealt or didn't with the war that engulfed the planet. Ian Fleming brings us to international locations of the 1950s and early 60s through the lens of the British position in the post-war world. Jean Le Carré takes us on missions of the early Cold War in all its moral ambiguity. David Morrell transports us back to the early 1970s to an America divided over Vietnam in First Blood. We continue into the 1980s with Rambo's creator as he brings together the most compelling elements of US and UK espionage thrillers in his Brotherhood of the Rose trilogy. Starting in the 1970s, Nelson DeMille, Robert Ludlum, and Frederick Forsyth begin to immerse us in the worlds of crime and spycraft. This same time machine takes us beneath the waves with the young Jack Ryan and Tom Clancy's The Hunt for Red October, in a showdown with the Soviet Navy in what was to be their final decade. We meet Pulitzer Prize winner Stephen Hunter's Bob Lee Swagger in the 90s and see the world through the eyes of a Vietnam veteran 20 years removed from the conflict in Southeast Asia. The novels of my youth transported me back to World War II, the Cold War in Vietnam, and others were contemporary thrillers that now facilitate my time travel back to the 1980s and 90s. It was Simon & Schuster, Atria, and Emily Bessler Books author, the late great Vince Flynn, who gave us the legendary Mitch Rapp in thrillers that I would read on my way to Iraq and Afghanistan. His books bridge the divide between the pre- and post-9/11 worlds, ultimately giving us a hero for the 21st century, a hero who resonated not just with Americans, but readers around the world. Vince's books are now a time machine, bringing readers and listeners back to the years of the global war on terror. A post-war on terror phase in the thriller genre began following the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. This era is still being defined, but future readers and listeners will one day turn to the thrillers of today to be transported back to this time. Thank you to Simon & Schuster for a century of connecting readers and now listeners with authors and their work, and for being the conduit through which the authors of today build the time machines of tomorrow. Congratulations on 100 years of publishing. Thank you for welcoming me into the fold and allowing me to be a part of it. I am humbled, and I can't wait for what's ahead. Thank you.
Best-selling novelist and author of the iconic memoir, The Glass Castle, Jeanette Walls.
Thank you. The most precious gift I ever received was a really wacky childhood. But for much of my life, I did everything that I could to hide the details of that story. I love hearing other people's stories, but I thought nobody would understand mine. It's just so nutty and sometimes dark and sometimes magical, but always chaotic. And I did everything I could to hide that. I became a journalist and told other people's stories, but went to great lengths to hide my own. I'd become quite friendly with another journalist, and he told me everything about his life, but I kept quiet about mine. And then finally one day I figured I just had to come clean. So I told him one day, I said, you know, there's some things you should know about me. I had a kind of weird childhood. And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, when I was 3 years old, I was cooking hot dogs for myself, and my dress caught on fire. And I had to be taken to the hospital, and I got a bunch of skin grafts and stuff like that. And he said, what are you trying to tell me? I said, I'm covered with nasty scars. And he said, why are you telling me this? I said, well, I'm a little dinged up. I'm kind of damaged goods. And he said, you're apologizing? He said, oh, no, don't ever apologize for those scars. He said, those scars are a sign that you survived and that you are stronger than whatever you were up against. And I said, I just wish I was nice and smooth like other people. And he said, oh, no, smooth is boring. You have texture. He said, texture is really interesting. So I married that man. I married him, and he pulled my story out of me, and he urged me to get it published. And I got to tell you, I was so wrong about people. They understand my story. They are so compassionate and empathetic, and often in exchange for my having told my story, they share their stories with me. And sometimes they're crying and they'll say, I'm so ashamed of this. I've never told anybody before, but I thought you would understand. And I'm thinking, why would you be ashamed of that? That's a beautiful story. And we're, oh yeah, that's the way that I felt too. And one time I traveled to this really well-to-do area, Southern Florida, and we're talking major money. And I told that story about what my husband had said about wanting to be smooth and like everybody else and not have texture, and him saying that smooth is boring and texture is interesting. And afterwards, this woman comes up to me and she says, sweetie, come here. Let me explain something to you. And she said, there is no such thing as smooth. She said, you look close enough, silk's got texture. And I thought that's the wisest and kindest thing that anybody has ever said to me. And that is why I share it with you all today. We're all a little dinged up. We all have our texture. And what I ask of you is that if you are lucky enough to have the silky texture, don't think that that somehow makes you less strong or less fascinating. And if you are lucky enough to have texture that's a little bit rougher, don't ever be ashamed of that. It is your texture. They are your scars. They are your stories. And sharing them can change your life.
Thank you so much.
The happiest days of this writer's life have been with Nan Graham, Susan Moldow, Roz Lapel, and Katie Monahan, and the whole crew at Scribner's. It's been like, I don't know, 26, 27 years. But as you know, Scribner's is just one part of a larger whole, Simon & Schuster. They've been around a lot longer. Happy 100th birthday to the best publishing house in the world, in my humble opinion, of course. Thank you.
Introducing the acclaimed composer, dramatist, two-time Edgar Award-winning author, singer-songwriter, and Tony Award winner of Best Musical for The Mystery of Edwin Drood, Rupert Holmes.
I want to thank God for that lovely introduction. Thank you, God. And especially the mention of my awards. Of course, awards mean nothing, as I so often tell my sons, Tony, Tony, and Tony. And my daughter, Edgar. The first mystery I ever bought with my own money was published by S&S. The Finishing Stroke by Ellery Queen, 1958. I was 11. Of course, in my life, S&S has also stood for storytelling and songwriting. And I've been asked to share with you tonight how stories made my music career possible, and very much vice versa. In high school, I thought I was going to have to choose between music and writing. I loved them both. But then I thought, if I wrote story songs, I could have my cake and eat it too, which is, by the way, a perfectly reasonable goal for those who want cake. And I quickly discovered that each time I put a story into one of my tunes, my music career took a huge step forward. I'll give you 3 examples. I was 19, I was attending the Manhattan School of Music as a clarinet major. The only person I knew in show business was a combination junior recording engineer and custodian at Scepter Records recording studio. He'd been given the opportunity to make one 45 RPM single with the garage band of his choice. He said to me, how do I get noticed with no album, no publicity? I said, well, if I were you, I'd make a record that gets banned. There will be controversy, exposure. He said, will you write me a song that gets banned? And I said, yes, because when I was 19, all I ever said was yes. So I was thinking about what could get banned while I was working on an arrangement of 16 Tons, which was a song about mining, when on the TV set came a cooking show called The Galloping Gourmet. Dining, mining. And as anyone would have done, I instantly thought, cannibalism during a mining disaster. Trapped in a mine what had caved in, and everyone knows the only ones left was Joe and me and Tim. When they broke through to pull us free, the only ones left to tell the tale was Joe and me. Timothy, where on earth did you go? Well, where he went was they ate him. Stupid, right? The record went to number 12 on the Billboard charts. The greatest love song about cannibalism ever recorded. I had my first top 20 hit at the age of 19, all because I loved telling stories. Soon I was making my first solo album as a recording artist on CBS Records, and my budget ran out. I just ran out of money. And so the album's final cut would have to be just me singing alone at the piano, which meant the lyric would have to provide all the color in the song. So, a man writes a long overdue love letter to his girlfriend who's traveling in Spain. He mails this love letter to her, but the very next day he receives an angry letter from her saying she hasn't heard from him in weeks and that she's done with him. And the man says, I sat with swords in my heart and pen in my hand. I wrote, I'm glad that we're through, full of hate I mailed it. But then in a week, her letter arrived. With love did it speak, and her note read, I love the tender words you sent. It seems I wronged you. Please forgive me. I'll return. My ship leaves soon. But God, I know now that she'll never sail. Our letters will cross in the mail. The album came out, and a few weeks later I get this phone call. A voice says, hi, this is Barbra Streisand. I love that song about the letters. You and I should make an album together. I said, that is the lousiest Barbra Streisand impression I've ever heard. Who is this? Well, the album I wrote, arranged, and conducted for Barbra was called Lazy Afternoon. It went platinum. And in conjunction with her recent autobiography, Barbra just re-released this very same tune in a collection of songs that hold special meaning for her. All this because I loved telling stories. Now, because of Barbra, my songs are being recorded by other singers, and better yet, my lyrics are being published in Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine as mysteries. People are noticing that I'm telling stories. Joe Papp, the legendary producer of A Chorus Line, says to me, you know, your story songs are like theater. Did you ever think of writing a musical? I had, and I instantly said, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Charles Dickens died halfway through writing it. I'll let the audience vote on who done it. Joe said, it's interesting. So you'll do the songs, but who will write the script? I said, well, I thought I would. He said, can you do that? I said, Joe, for 10 years, my stories could only take 3 minutes, and they've all had to rhyme. To have 2 hours to tell a story that doesn't have to rhyme, that's got to be the easiest thing in the world to do. 4 years later, I'd finished the musical. It opened on Broadway and won that year's Tony Award for Best Musical, and I received the Tonys for Best Music, Lyric, and Book, all because I loved a story that Charles Dickens hadn't finished telling. And that's how it's been my whole blessed career. Words with music, music with words. In terms of having my cake and eating it too, call me Betty Crocker. For my non-musical plays on Broadway, I get to write the incidental music. On my AMC TV series, Remember When, I wrote 56 episodes, and then I got to write the underscore for each episode. This is even carried over into my book career. When my glorious editor convinced me to start writing novels, and he'd learned that one of them was going to be set in the big band era, he persuaded me to write and record a musical CD of all the fictional songs referenced in the text to be included with the hardcover. And the producers of the streaming TV series being developed of my bestseller, Murder Your Employer, have just asked me if I'd compose the music for the pilot. And so it continues. I want to thank Ben Krause at the piano. Can I hear it for Ben? And I particularly want to thank all of you tonight for listening to this very far-fetched but completely true story about my storytelling and my songwriting. I'm going to leave you now with an abbreviated version of my best-known story song. It was #1 in Billboard the last week of 1979 and the first week of 1980, so I can tell you in all honesty, it was at the top of the charts for 2 decades without interruption. My recording of it has been used in over 40 motion pictures and TV shows, so you've probably heard this before, but this time you may want to follow the storyline with me. I was tired of my lady. We'd been together too long. Like a worn-out recording of a favorite song. So while she lay there sleeping, I read the paper in bed, and in the personal column, there was this letter I read. Goes, if you like pina coladas and getting caught in the rain, if you're not into yoga, if you have half a brain, if you like making love at midnight in the dunes on the Cape, then I'm the love that you've looked for. Write to me and escape. Now, to save time, I'll explain that the hero replies to the ad and arranged to meet the woman who placed the ad at a barcode at Mally's the very next day. And he says, so I waited with high hopes. She walked in the place. I knew her smile in an instant. I knew the curve of her face. It was my own lovely lady. And she said, oh, it's you. Then we stared at each other. And I said, I never knew that you like pina coladas, getting caught in the rain, and the feel of the ocean, and the taste of champagne. If you'd like making love at midnight in the dunes on the Cape, then I'm the love that you've looked for. Come with me and escape. Come with me and escape. Happy birthday, SNS. Please have 100 more.
Such a great group of people. That is my biggest takeaway from publishing, is that everyone is so kind, and not just the authors, but just kind of up and down the chain of command, as we would say back in my old military days. It's fantastic.
You know, every kid who loves to read has these fantasies of being in the library after everyone's gone home, and this is better than that because, oh my gosh, I was just talking to Judy Blue. It's amazing.
Yeah, I just felt honored to be a part of it, especially when you see the names. You get to be on stage with Judy Blume and Jerry Seinfeld. Like, yeah, of course, why not?
You know, I really felt a lot. I was very happy.
I didn't really do a lot of in-person stuff when the book first came out, so it's just really amazing to be able to be here and see people's faces in real life.
I just thought of the company that I'm keeping, not only the authors who are here this evening, but the authors I've spent my life reading. Simon & Schuster is a history of our culture, of our times, so just to be included is glorious.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the beloved and acclaimed novelist John Irving.
Thank you very much. Kurt Vonnegut was the first reader of my first novel. It was set in Vienna before the Anschluss and in post-war Austria during and after the Allied occupation. I was lucky to have Vonnegut for my first reader. He'd been a POW in Dresden. Kurt knew about the Nazis and what happened in Europe after them. I was also lucky to have Joe Fox at Random House for my first editor. As a young writer, if you have a good editor, you develop the confidence to take risks. You know your editor will catch you if you fall. Joe Fox and Random House published my first 3 novels. Then Joe had the insight and the courage to kick me out. With The World According to Garp, my 4th novel, Joe knew he couldn't really rally the rest of Random House behind me. He told me to go to a smaller publisher where a single editor could get the whole house to support me. Joe Fox was a visionary. He even told me which publisher and which editor to take GARP to. Henry Robbins at Dutton was successful with GARP, but Henry died. Should I come back to you in Random House? I asked Joe. Too soon, Joe said. What he meant was the rest of Random House wasn't begging him to have me come back. Joe sent me to Harvey Ginsberg at William Morrow. Harvey was a great editor. Harvey published the Cider House Rules and A Prayer for Owen Meany. Then someone new was hired to run William Morrow. Harvey wasn't crazy about the new boss. Now's the time to go back to Joe at Random House, Harvey told me. Harvey's right, Joe said, but we'll make Random House pay Harvey to be your editor. Harvey knows the way you write now better than I do, Joe Fox told me. He was looking after me even when he wasn't my editor. Joe would publish A Son of the Circus at Random House. That novel had a first reader who got Joe's attention. At the time, this was the longest novel I'd written. Joe made a young editorial assistant read it. This young reader wrote some notes. The notes were written for Joe, not for me, but the notes were so good, Joe wanted me to see them. The notes were amazing. I called Joe, and he spelled it out for me. After I die, and I will, this kid should be your editor, Joe told me. A Son of the Circus was published in 1994. Joe Fox died in 1995. A few years later, this is why I ended up with Jonathan Karp as my editor. I did what Joe Fox told me to do. John Karp is the best editor I've had, and I've had 4 good ones. I'm very happy for John and for Simon Schuster Centennial, but I'm very glad John Karp isn't 100 years old. Then I'd have to find a 5th editor. Thank you.
And now, please give a warm round of applause to New Yorker staff writer and best-selling author Susan Orlean.
I decided I wanted to burn a book. This wasn't an act of idle vandalism. I wasn't protesting against my chosen profession. It was research. I was writing a book about the largest library fire in American history, an arson fire at the Los Angeles Public Library that destroyed 400,000 books and damaged 700,000 more. While working on the book, I realized that I had never seen a book burn. As a diligent reporter and someone who really likes to describe things accurately, I needed to commit the act. I needed to burn a book. But it wasn't as easy as it seemed. Burning a book felt like a gesture of violence, one that would connect me with the worst people in the history of civilization. As it was, I could hardly bring myself to even get rid of a book, even one I had no plans to read, or one that was tattered and worn and past the point of salvation. But for the purposes of my book, I had to do it. I needed to witness the burning of a book. So now the problem was to choose which one. At first I thought, I'll just burn a book I don't like. Wouldn't that be easy?
I went to my bookshelf and eyed a few unlucky candidates. Books I'd never opened, books I read and hated. So many choices. Then I wobbled. It seemed so nasty to burn a book I didn't like. I just couldn't do it. Okay, I thought, I'll burn a book I like. At least then the act wouldn't seem so hostile. I surveyed my favorites. I see you, Faulkner. I see you, Hemingway. I see you, John Irving. But damn it, I couldn't burn a book I liked. It just seemed so wrong. A few days later, I had a brilliant thought. I would burn one of my books. Thanks to the generous folks at Simon & Schuster, I have lots of copies of those. Perhaps I even have too many copies. I ran my hands over my stash. I would only be dooming one of them. How bad could that be? And yet something rose up inside of me and resisted. This is insane, I thought. I can't burn one of my own books, the fruit of my loins, my life's work. I can't. I gave up. I conferred with my husband, John, and I told him that as good an idea as it seemed, as important as it was for my research, I simply couldn't do it. There was something in me that couldn't overcome this taboo, the feeling that burning a book was terribly wrong. John urged me to reconsider, but I wouldn't. I was going to have to write about this epic library fire without knowing what a burning book looked like. Then one day, John came home with a huge smile on his face. "Come here," he said. "I've got it. I've got the perfect book for you to burn." He reached inside a bag and pulled out a fresh new copy of Fahrenheit 451. The perfect candidate. The book about book burning would be the book I would burn. And I thought to myself, this is why I married John. Thank you and happy birthday, Simon & Schuster.
Please welcome two of today's most innovative writers, two-time National Book Award winner and MacArthur Genius Grant recipient Jesmyn Ward, and Newbery Honor, Prince Honor, and NAACP Image Award recipient Jason Reynolds.
We got 6 minutes. What's happening? Everybody okay? Y'all all right? Okay, so Jesmyn, my first question and the biggest question I have for you this evening. You are, to me, I know you hate this, but to me and to many of them, one of the greatest of our time, right? One of the greatest contemporary writers of our time. And someone who has absolutely. And someone who has accomplished all that you've accomplished and done all the things you've done. My question is, where does this begin? Like, how does this begin for you?
When we were upstairs in the balcony and we were watching everyone on stage, I was thinking about how I would answer that question because I didn't have anything prepared. I thought back, to my childhood. And I came late to reading. I wasn't an early reader. I struggled to learn how to read. I finally got it when I was in first grade. But once I learned, I attempted to I read a lot, right? I was a library reader because I only had access to my elementary school library. And so I grew up in the 80s, so I read a lot of Newbery, award books, Caldecott, right? Island of the Blue Dolphins, Scholastic Book Fair would come, and it was like Hero and the Crown, and right? I read lots of books about, I found myself drawn to books about like spunky, fiery, smart, courageous girls, right? And all of those books that I read about those kinds of girls, those stories resonated with me, right? And then when I got older and I was in junior high and I was in high school, I discovered The Bluest Eye, and I discovered The Color Purple, and I discovered, For Colored Girls, Ntozake Shange, right? And those books also resonated with me, but nothing reflected me. And I think that perhaps part of the reason that I read the way that I did so voraciously when I was a kid and when I was growing up was because I was constantly trying to find the book that would reflect me. And I think some books came really close, like the aforementioned books, right? But none of them were a clear mirror. Like I couldn't see myself in the books that I read, and I couldn't see the people around me in the books that I read. And for me, like as I was sitting up there, I started thinking about, okay, so maybe it wasn't one book, right? Maybe all the books that I read and that I loved as a child and as an adolescent, like maybe they sort of ferried me towards this endeavor. But for me, there was a document, I think, that really set me on my way, and it was, my brother was killed by a drunk driver when he was 19, and the drunk driver was not held accountable for his murder, and so it was a court document, right, where that person was actually charged with leaving the scene of an accident. And I saw that court document when I was like 23 years old, and the complete erasure of that document, I think that set me on my path.
Wow.
So,
I thought we were all going to sit
right,
for a minute.
Sorry. I'm going to turn around on you, Jason. So Jason, I don't know if y'all know, but Jason is working on an adult literary novel, right? So, yes, very excited.
Working on.
So he's writing, right? So I want to know what book or moment set you on that path.
I'll tell you what, it's weird. It's too long of a story for this evening. See me outside, and I'll tell you the whole thing. But what I will tell you is what I thought about this a little bit yesterday. At my mom's house, Sunday, I go to my mom's house on Sunday mornings. We do the whole mother-son thing in the mornings. My auntie comes over, and at this particular juncture, we're like planning my aunt's 80th birthday. This just happened yesterday. We're planning my aunt's 80th birthday party, which is in a month from now. I'm working on the flyer. I'm at the computer because they're 80, right? My mother is 78, 79. So I'm on the computer and like I'm writing the flyer up, right? And my mom is like, we're gonna go through everything line by line. So is this the address correct? Talking to her sister. That's right. Is this, the right, dinner is at 7. That's right. And she's like, okay, well, here's the colors. Black, white, and gold. And then my auntie, whose birthday it is, she's like, oh, and green. And my mother says, ain't nobody wearing no green to your party, right? And then my auntie says, I'm gonna wear green to the party. And my mother says, then you wear the green, but I'm not putting black, white, gold, and green on here. Them colors don't go, right? And then the two of them get into this wild bickering match in front of me, right? These 80-year-old women are like fighting about this. And then after it's all over, after they like fighting and they're really angry, and then my aunt says, all right, whatever, you do whatever you wanna do. The breakfast is almost ready. And my mom says, did you get the sausage out? My auntie says the sausage is on the table, and then they separate, and then my mom goes and has breakfast with her sister. And I think to myself, the only difference between writing children's and writing for adults is just the tone. Because those two ladies, that's it, right? Because if I think of those two old ladies, if I imagine them when they were 13, 14, the argument is the exact same argument, right? But like young people do, you get over it and you have breakfast. It goes away, right? But if I think about it as their age and I look at them in their context, it's because my auntie understands the impermanence of life and she wants what she wants in case it's the last time she gets to have it, right? Simon & Schuster, we want to say happy birthday to you. Thank you for letting us play around with you. We love y'all.
Please join us in welcoming poet, novelist, humorist, children's book author, psychoanalytic researcher, and journalist Judith Viorst.
Good evening. I'm really thrilled to be here tonight to help celebrate Simon & Schuster's 100th, particularly since it's one of the rare occasions these days when I'm actually a little younger than the honoree. Simon & Schuster and I first met in 1968 when somebody came down from New York and asked my husband Milton and me to write the Washington Underground Gourmet, part of its series on cheap eats. It practically destroyed our marriage, and we got very fat, but it was a start. I was told I'm supposed to talk about being a writer tonight, but I do want to take a moment to say, I've been with Simon & Schuster a very long time. They've published all my children's books and all my grown-up books by now by various sellings and dealings with other companies. And I have to mention some of the delicious, wonderful editors I've had, Joni and Herman and Fred and Caitlin, and now my new editor, Mindy. They take very good care of me, and I'm a very lucky lady. So now I can tell you about my youthful career. I only had one ambition in life. I had never, ever thought of doing anything else but becoming a writer. So at the age of 7 and 8, I started sending out my very heartfelt, very beautiful poems to my mother's women's magazines. Lined notebook paper, sharpened number 2 pencil, my best printing. And I had a specialty. My specialty was that every poem I wrote and sent out had a dead body in it. You know. The first one was an ode to my dead mother and father, both alive and rather irritated. I went through dead dogs, dead soldiers. I once killed an entire very large family. And this wasn't because I was a particularly morbid little girl, but because my mother's favorite poem, which she recited often while I was growing up, was Annabel Lee. Well, you know, that's Poe, his beautiful maiden, in the tomb by the sounding sea, and this creepy boyfriend that comes and sleeps with her at night. I loved it. And somehow I got the impression that a poem couldn't be a poem unless it had a corpse in it. So I delivered. I delivered right through to the end of my teens. And as I was writing this talk the other night, it suddenly struck me that it was really so sad that I had written all these beautiful poems, and not only did they not publish them, they probably didn't even read them. And then I got this thought, I have a captive audience tonight. It's only going to be 4 lines, but folks, I am going to recite to you the poem I wrote when I was 18 years old. Keep in mind, I was a very, very sincere 18-year-old. Death and desire crumpled in a corner, and I in black, the solitary mourner. Often finale, but birth, thank God, more often. And yet I fear, I know too well, the coffin. Thank you, thank you. I knew somebody was going to like that poem someday. Now, how I got from my death and desire phase to where I am today is a mystery even to me, though I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that I got married and out of necessity developed a sense of humor, had some children, developed more of a sense of humor, and pretty soon my only serious line about death in poetry was the one I wrote in which I said, "And when he's late for dinner, and I know he must be either having an affair or lying dead in the middle of the street, I always hope he's dead." So, anyway, I want you to all know about my evolution and the fact that I have had 56, now I counted them, 56 terrific years with S&S, and I wish them a very, very happy birthday. Thank you.
Introducing best-selling author and Emmy Award-winning chief medical correspondent for CNN, Dr. Sanjay Gupta.
Good evening, everybody, and happy birthday to Simon & Schuster. I want to tell you a quick story. One night a few years ago, I was in the operating room on call when one of my residents brought me an emergency CT scan of a man's head. Immediately, the problem was really clear to me. Just between the man's skull and his brain, there was this concave strip of blood, something known as a subdural hematoma. It was causing pressure on the man's right frontal lobe, and this is typically a surgical emergency. Now, just as I was getting ready to take the next steps, the resident told me the patient's age, 93. Suddenly, several things started to swirl in my head. What kind of life did this man have? What kind of life would he want? And where is that line between prolonging life or prolonging death? I thought a lot about my own parents. What would they be thinking at that age? With all this in mind, I went to go talk to his family to have a conversation. Now, a woman who looked to be only in her 60s walked over to me, introducing herself as his wife. I momentarily hesitated, and sensing my confusion, she said, "I'm actually older than he is. I robbed the cradle." She was 94 years old. She was in perfect health, took no medicines, was still driving, and had in fact driven her great-grandkids to school earlier that morning. Her husband, my patient, the 93-year-old, I was told was even healthier than her. He was still an avid runner, worked part-time as an accountant. They kept him around, his 65-year-old son told me, because he was such a whiz with numbers. In fact, his brain bleed had occurred because he had fallen from a roof because he'd climbed up there with a leaf blower to clear away the leaves. These nonagenarians, as they're called, were healthier than most of my patients at any age. So given all that, I took the man to the operating room to perform a brain operation known as a craniotomy. You drill several burr holes into the skull, use an electric saw device to connect those burr holes, and you remove a flap of bone. After that, I opened up the outer layer of his brain, known as the dura, and then I was looking at that large collection of blood. I carefully removed that blood collection, stopped any remaining small bleeders, and the critical part of the operation was completed. The man of the brain was decompressed. Now, all that was left to do was close the dura, replace the blown flap, and suture the skin. Before I did that, however, I decided to closely inspect his brain. And what I saw really surprised me. Given how sharp he had been, how cognitively intact, I expected to see this large brain pulsating robustly, looking healthy. And what I saw looked like a 93-year-old's brain. It was more shriveled, it was more sunken, had these deep wrinkles indicative of his age. Now, if this sounds disheartening, it should not. In fact, just the opposite. It's a reminder that it didn't matter what his brain looked like, it mattered how it performed. Of course his brain had aged. He was 93 years old. But the brain, maybe more so than any other organ in the body, can reliably grow stronger and grow sharper throughout life. I think it's the only organ that in many ways can defy aging. It's what inspired me to write the book Keep Sharp. Now, as you might imagine, I was anxious to see how this gentleman would wake up from the operation. I went to go visit him in the ICU, and I found him lying in bed reading his smartphone. He told me he was following the recent elections in West Africa, as one does after emergency brain surgery. It was pretty clear that he was recovering well, and after examining him, I decided to ask him, how did the whole event really affect him? How did it make him think about his mortality overall? He smiled and he looked at me and he said, I think the biggest lesson in all this is no more trying to blow the leaves off the roof. That guy taught me a lot. You see, increasingly, we think of someone like him as the exception to the rule. But I think our thinking is starting to shift. It is possible that 93-year-old man is becoming the rule. Happy birthday, Simon & Schuster. Thanks for having me. What an honor.
Please give a round of applause to best-selling novelists Rebecca Searle and Laura Dave.
Hi, everyone. Hi, friends. So Laura and I are legitimately like very, very close friends. She is my first phone call in a crisis or on a Tuesday. Sometimes they're the same thing. And we were on the phone a few weeks ago. I was getting ready to leave for book tour for my new novel, Expiration Dates, out now everywhere books are sold. Thank you. And my jaw just came off of its hinges.
You were supposed to speak that day about this.
Yes, about this, and instead we were talking about my deep-seated fear of death by jaw.
Yes, exactly. And that got us thinking about fear, specifically about fear and writing.
Yes.
And we were curious, is there anyone in this beautiful group of people tonight who's interested in writing a book? Yes. We have some hands. Don't be fearful to raise. Yes. Okay. So we thought we would talk a little bit about, as two fearful people,
We are.
The idea that fear can be your gift when you're writing a book.
Yeah. I wanted to tell a story tonight that's really special to me. So when I was getting ready to write my novel in 5 years, I knew one of the main characters was going to have to die. And I was really trying to get out of it. I was trying to avoid it. I didn't want to have to go through it, but it had to happen. It was the best version of the story. And I was really scared. I was scared of what I was going to have to put the character through. I was scared of what I was going to have to go through. And I'll never forget this. My very dear friend and fellow novelist, Lila Sales, said to me, just stay close to her. And I always think about that when I'm starting a new project and I'm nervous about the journey ahead of just taking my protagonist's hand and staying close, and that together, if we maintain that, we can cross whatever divide we have to get across in order to tell the story that needs to be told.
I think that that's really, so as someone who has so much fear, I'm looking up at these books, which also, it's so fun.
It's fun.
But the first one up there for me, I was so fearful about trying to figure out how to get through it that I had 90,000 words back in 2015 of that book that I threw, not metaphorically, quite literally. I was driving down Highway 29 in Northern California, and I threw it into a bin.
I remember
it was
that.
saved on my computer, so it was more of a gesture. But I was like, I'm gonna get rid of this right now because I was so fearful I couldn't find the end of that book. And the one next to it, which is coming out in September.
It's so good. I've read it. It's so good.
That book has two characters on which the axis of everyone else sort of, rolls around. And for me, I always try to write into the good of people. Even my villains aren't particularly villainous. And these two characters are actually quite complicated. They have a 50-year love affair that some people I felt like might take issue with. And in trying to figure out how to tell their story, I have found myself having a lot of fear about the perception of them.
Yeah.
And I came across this quote in my research. There's an architect in the book, and Louis Kahn, the Salk Institute, he had a quote that now I can't believe I didn't have keeping me company for all the years I've been trying to sit at my desk and do my work, which is that when something brings you fear, when something brings you difficulty, instead of suppressing it, which is our instinct, what if we own it? And so I went the other way when I saw that with these characters, and I instead of anticipating judgment, I leaned into the judgment, and that's sort of when the good came out.
Yeah.
And so I think about that now in terms of how, we can approach fear in writing.
Yeah, and I think that in thinking about and talking about what we wanted to share with you all here tonight, I think we really came to that the book that you're afraid to write is the book that you're meant to write. When you feel that resistance, that fear of what your character is going to have to go through, what you're going to have to go through, judgment of the being out in the world, it means you've tapped into something, a story that wants and needs to be told.
Yes, and we were also talking about, just before we say goodnight, how grateful we are to SNS for helping and supporting us telling stories. Congratulations on 100 years.
We're very grateful. Congratulations.
And here's to the next 100.
Here's to the next 100.
Joining us from the UK, international best-selling author Ruth Ware.
Oh my gosh. Well, I have been sitting backstage listening to all the talks and marveling at this stellar lineup and trying to figure out how on earth I ended up on stage following so many of my own literary heroes. It is maybe appropriate, therefore, that I would like to talk to you this evening about imposter syndrome. Because here's the thing, I have always wanted to be a writer, right back as far as I can remember. I was always scribbling little stories that grew into longer stories, and finally, by the time I was a teenager, into, I guess, book-length things, maybe not books. All through my teens and my 20s, I was writing and writing, but for some reason, I never tried to get published. I kept writing and putting my books under the bed, and I think it was this combination of raging imposter syndrome and something else, kind of the opposite, a kind of pride and a reluctance to know for sure that I was not good enough. It wasn't until I had kids that something changed. I was on maternity leave with my second baby. I was in a library, looking down the barrel of having to go back to work at a fairly demanding job. And I realized suddenly that my writing was a hobby. And I didn't have time for hobbies anymore. I barely had time to wash my hair. If I didn't find a way to make my writing pay, ideally enough for an extra day's childcare, I was not going to be able to keep doing this thing that I loved. And so, for the first time, I invested in myself. I bought a cheap laptop so that I could type while my baby napped. I bought books, Stephen King's on writing. I submitted, and I got rejected. Of course I did. The worst had happened. Someone had echoed that little voice in my head and told me that, no, actually, I was not good enough. 5 years before, I would have shelved the book. I would have crawled back into my shell, but this time something had changed. Maybe having kids had made me braver, more willing to sacrifice my pride for something that I truly wanted. Maybe this time I had written a book that I simply couldn't bear to shelve. Whatever the reason, I kept revising, I kept submitting, and eventually I found an agent and a publisher. And 15 years later, here I am. Of course, that little voice in the back of my head saying, is this really the best you can do? that little voice has not been silenced by being published. It has stayed very loud. It has given me some pretty sleepless nights, mostly at 3 a.m. in the morning when I'm too far through a manuscript to quit. But it has also pushed me to try harder, to hone my craft. I think it has made me a better writer. And for that reason, I never want to silence it, or not completely. But there is another reason why I want to keep listening to that voice, and it's one that is not actually about me at all, because the flip side of the question, why me, is the answer, why not her, or him, or them? Because the truth is, I have been astonishingly lucky with my career. I've been lucky with my books, I've been lucky with my timing, I have been lucky most of all with my simply extraordinary publisher, the reason we're all here tonight. And there are plenty of amazing writers who haven't been as lucky as me, writers who fully deserve a place at the table, but who haven't been given one for whatever reason. And that is something that I never want to forget. So I guess what I have learned over the years from my imposter syndrome is not to ignore that little voice inside your head, to try to listen to it, learn from it when you can, let it make you more careful, more diligent, more exacting, but don't let it make you afraid, and never, ever let it shut you up. Thank you.
Please welcome best-selling author Zakiya Dalila Harris.
Wow, there are so many of you here. So I've always hated public speaking. Probably a weird time to say that, but it's true. I really hate being in the spotlight, being the center of attention. It's not my jam. It makes me nervous. I've been nervous this entire night, and hearing how amazing these speeches have been has made me all the more nervous, but also in wonderful company. So when I started writing The Other Black Girl, which follows a young black woman working as an editorial assistant in a mostly white publishing house, I decided to maybe put a few details of myself into it, because that is how I love to express myself, through my words, through writing, not in this format. And so I, naturally sprinkled in a few details about my own personal life just to flesh it out, because like Nella, I worked at a very white publishing house myself. I will not say the name of that publishing house in this room, but it rhymes with Schmengwin Spandam Schmaus. You've never heard of it, it's fine. And I got out, everyone, because it was hard. And also like Nella, my protagonist in The Other Black Girl, I grew up in a very white suburb in Connecticut. I'd been called an Oreo, I'd been told I talked like a white girl, and most importantly, like Nella, I had a lot of insecurities about not being black enough. So I put a few details of my personal life into my main character, and I was lucky enough to find an audience and editors in the world, and went to auction, where I found my lovely home with Lindsay Sagnet at Atria. Shout out to my team, I love you guys. But I had to kind of develop the shtick after a while, because as many of us know, being an author means having a shtick, having an author persona, if you will. And once the book sold, I was very, very nervous, because I will never forget the night. I believe it was Valentine's Day 2020. My phone was going off. This social media had caught wind of the deal. It was very big and splashy and loud, which is every writer's dream, but it was not my dream. I remember feeling nauseous as all these messages are coming in from friends and family and ex-boyfriends that I really never needed to hear from again. And also, there was maybe a pandemic coming to New York, so that might have also been the nausea. But I developed this persona to make it easier, right? That's what it does. We can create these sound bites, and part of my kind of shtick was having worked in book publishing, getting really tired of it, being the only one, and also not getting paid very much. Sorry, guys, it's true. And also the fact that I quit my job at Schmango Schmandom Schmaus to go on and hopefully write a novel called The Other Black Girl. And I wrote it in less than a year. And so there are these big parts of my story that everyone latched onto, and I have no regret for that because I hoped it would become a source of inspiration for other writers who just, really wanted to quit and not have health insurance at all and just like move on into the unknown. But also I hoped my story would be inspiring for anyone who's ever been the only one in a space. In a workplace, in academia, the list goes on, but that has been one of the wonderful things about sharing my story. The hard thing about that, though, is that I've now had to unlearn this personal or public narrative, if you will, that I've put out there. One anecdote is that when my novel was adapted for a TV show with Hulu, I'm in the writer's room, and the writers are picking apart my main character, Nella, talking about all of her insecurities, psychoanalyzing her, like, why is she like this? And I had to pull my showrunner aside and tell her, this is weird. I need to divorce myself from this character. I need to cut the cord. So the next day, no one asked me to do this, but I made a formal speech, and I said, guys, I am no longer Nella. Nella is no longer me. I set her free. I didn't say it like that, but I definitely was very pointed about, I don't want you to feel weird because I feel weird, and now we don't have to feel weird about putting this character on the screen. And I'm so glad I did that because it kind of helped pave the way for me as I'm writing my second book, which, writing. Thank you. I need that. Thank you. I need that. Writing first books is hard. Writing second books is harder. I wonder, and this is probably not the place to say this either, but I wonder why the heck I do this a lot of the time. And I know why I do it. I love the work. I love storytelling. So much of the narrative from The Other Black Girl was more about who I am, or who I was, really, because I feel like I've outgrown Nella in my own way. I've had to lead conversations, I've had to speak out, especially while making the TV show, because that stuff is hard. And I've had to just really lean into the craft again, and that's the most beautiful part of it all, right? It's not about sound bites, it's not about social media and all of that. I mean, it is, but it's not, right? It's because you enjoy doing it and doing what you love is a wonderful thing that we get to do. So thank you for listening to my shtick, my spiel. I'm so honored to be here celebrating with you all tonight. Happy birthday, SNS.
And now the Pulitzer Prize and National Book Critics Circle Award winner, Jennifer Egan.
I've become more and more interested in what I think of as inadvertent storytelling, genres reused for practical purposes that have unintended narrative qualities. One of these is the to-do list. Now, I am an excessive maker of lists. In fact, as of this morning, I have 990 lists in the notes function on my iPhone, dating back to 2011. When I got the phone. Clearly, I don't delete my lists. And the reason is that the moment a list is obsolete, it leaves the utilitarian sphere and becomes an artifact. It was poignant for me to reread on my very oldest list for my son's 9th birthday party, 1 hour, 15 minutes bounce time, and recall the party venue we booked in Brooklyn where kids bounced on inflatable slides. That same son's most recent birthday was 21, and any bouncing that took place was likely not intentional. Lists are also revealing of the person who makes them. Think about how much you can learn from someone's grocery list. Are they a carnivore? Do they have a newborn? A sweet tooth? Do they buy organic? Etc. As my list of lists has grown, I occasionally scroll down and stumble on an old list that I've completely forgotten about. One of these was called Lessons Learned, and its purpose apparently was to list things I wanted to do differently in the future. Unfortunately, I forgot all about the list after a few entries, so the plan was unfulfilled. But in retrospect, Lessons Learned read as somewhat comic: buy a narrower Christmas tree. Put up don't pick flowers sign as soon as bulbs come up. And my favorite, train ticket in bag night before always, in all caps. Each lesson suggested a mishap whose gist was clear from the lesson itself. I had forgotten all of those incidents. It struck me as a perfect example of inadvertent storytelling, and I wondered if there might be a way to somehow use it in fiction. Meanwhile, in the early days of Twitter, I was charmed by the elliptical quality of 140-character utterances, even a kind of unexpected poetry that resulted from their sheer brevity. As a tweeter, I had managed to do little more than get hacked and spew vitamin ads at my beleaguered followers, but I found myself asking myself whether Twitter might be a useful genre for fiction. Could a story be serialized 19th century fashion, tweet by tweet? And most importantly, what kind of story would naturally occur in such small structural units? The obvious answer was a story in the form of a list. So I began writing a story called Lessons Learned, about a female spy in the Mediterranean who infiltrates a group of plotters against America and records each step in her mission by noting what she has learned from it. It begins, people rarely look the way you expect them to, even when you've seen pictures. And it contains lines like, it is technically impossible for a man to look better in a Speedo than in swim trunks. The New Yorker tweeted the story back in 2012 under the title Black Box, and more recently, with the help of my legendary Scribner editor, Nan Graham, I was able to turn it into a chapter in my most recent novel, The Candy House. I know how lucky I am to have the best publisher in America. I've tried some alternatives, and I hope to stay as long as you'll have me. Happy birthday, Simon & Schuster.
Please welcome the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 19 novels, Lisa Jewell.
Oh, thank you. I have to say, I don't know about you, but I was not expecting to laugh as much as I have laughed tonight. And now I really, really wish I'd written something funny, but I haven't. So just expectation management there. Where do you get your ideas? Ideas for books are not necessarily what you imagine ideas for books to be. These books of mine, they don't come out of a notebook full of thrilling themes and socially relevant storylines and twisty-turny what-if scenarios I want to explore. They're not based on things I've read about or people I've met or stories they have shared with me. Sorry for all the people who shared stories with me. In a lot of ways, they're not even ideas. They come from out there, my books, from the world that I see in dizzying, swirling fragments every day of my life, banal, benign, boring fragments that for some reason land in my head with a satisfying thud and make me wonder about things, about people, about houses, that make my thoughts spiral towards untold stories and unseen worlds and people I'll never know. They come to me as windows, doors, eyes, fleeting tableau. A slight woman wearing a sheer muslin skirt, her skin tan mahogany, her hair thick with salt water. She's holding 2 small children by their hands as she yanks them up the boardwalk past the uninterested gaze of diners eating lunch at an upmarket beach club in Nice on the French Riviera. She strides towards the members-only shower block at the other end. She is clearly not a member. She looks frantic, she looks stressed, she looks hungry. She looks for some reason as if she has a story to tell. I store her away in my weird writer's brain and then think about her obsessively until the moment I can start to write about her. A man, 30-ish, of average height, with a stolid, slightly squat build, is stamping heavy-footed down a steep hill outside a small school where the children, just released from their day into the beginnings of a light snowfall, are running in circles, swiping handfuls of fine snow off car bonnets to make tiny snowballs which they throw at each other, but which disintegrate before they reach their intended victim. The man looks unimpressed, let down, ground down, entirely alone as he passes through them. The man, I decide, has a story to tell, so I store him away and then think about him obsessively until the moment I can start to write about him. Another man, I see him through a window this time. He sits in the bay of an apartment carved out of a grubby stucco house on a London rat run, the render-stained greige with pollution and bus fumes. He stares at his laptop, his nondescript face shining pale aqua from the light of the screen. Behind him are bare magnolia walls, and there is a door. I wonder where it leads. I wonder what's behind it. This man, his stark apartment, the door, all of it feels like it has a story to tell. I store them away and then think about them obsessively until the moment I can start to write about them. A pretty spring day, a cherry tree in full sugar pink bloom, a dingy basement in a dingy house with a slim window made of glass bricks. Imagine, I think, if there was someone locked away down there beyond that glorious, hopeful cherry blossom. Imagine if it was a child and that child's mother lived just around the corner and had no idea that they were there. That basement, I felt, had a story to tell. So I store it away and then think about it obsessively until I can start to write about it. They announce themselves in a very forward way, these moments. I am here, they say. I am your next book. So when the time finally comes, I open up a fresh document on my laptop and I start to write so that I can stop wondering and start discovering. Thank you very much, and happy birthday, Simon Schuster. Thank you.
Please give a big round of applause to National Book Award finalist Erica Armstrong Dunbar and to former Secretary of State and United States Senator and the first woman in U.S. history to become the presidential nominee of any major political party, #1 New York Times bestselling author Hillary Rodham Clinton.
So, good evening, Secretary Clinton.
It's been a good evening, hasn't it?
It's been a wonderful evening as we celebrate 100 years of reading and writing. And as you know, I'm a historian, so I think a lot about historiography or the writing of history. And I've been thinking a lot about our national story, or stories, and about the way that history allows us to think about a specific moment in time, about how it allows us to analyze society and culture, how we learn from history. What is the national story or stories that we need to tell now?
Stories are really important, especially if they have a factual basis.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
But I think we've just seen an example of why we've got to figure out what our story is. What are we telling ourselves? And maybe more importantly, what are we telling our children and our grandchildren? And right now, we have no narrative. We have a million different conflicting narratives about who we are, who we were, who we want to be. And I think it is a very dangerous time in our country because we have no unifying sense of what we should be doing to try to forge a path forward to a better future. But we have a lot of competing voices, some of them demagogic and siren songs, some of them from even outside of our country with their own stories that they want us to believe about ourselves. And I don't think there's ever been a more important obligation than to try to begin to tell a more unifying story. And that doesn't mean we whitewash the past. You're an expert on that. You've written really important parts of the American story. But it means that we try to dig our way out of the morass we find ourselves in right now to see a little bit of light ahead of us that we can all believe is possible if we start, once again, believing that we can make a better future than our present or our past, and we work together to achieve it.
Yeah. I also think part of that national story includes understanding that history does repeat itself, or it can, and that we need to learn from it and have it impact or affect our present, definitely our future. And we're all here tonight sort of thinking about the power of reading and writing. And I think we often tie reading and writing to leadership, at least in the modern, or at least most of the time. We think about people who have capacious minds, who read a lot, who write a lot. But I do think we can make a connection between reading, writing, and leadership. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think you're right, and we started the evening with Doris Kearns-Goodwin talking about her latest book, which is about the 1960s, but she's also, given us an extraordinary look at prior times and leaders in our country. And I don't think you can be I don't think you used to be able to be a leader without having read, maybe not right, but at least read enough to know about American history and your place in it and what it is you were trying to achieve. And now, attention spans have shrunk so much that people believe that, sound bites and clicks and videos substitute for really reading and immersing yourselves in history. And I do think there's a big danger that we're forgetting big chunks of our history and therefore missing the lessons we should be learning, because there are patterns in human nature, human life, human interactions, and the decisions that leaders are faced with. I'm teaching a course now at Columbia about, crisis decision making, and it's all about how do leaders get the information they need to make decisions. And it's not just in the moment that you look, but how does that moment connect to previous times, and what do you learn from that? So I'm hoping that we can have more of an effort to try to re-educate ourselves about our own history through reading, and those able, like yourself, through writing, to make it an even richer story.
Can we just close on you talking a little bit about a specific era in history that you're thinking a lot about these days, and that's suffrage. And this sort of new venture, but also the connective tissue between topics around the right to vote for women in particular, but the right to vote more broadly, and the ways that we educate through the theater, through the arts, and the importance and the power behind, in particular, this issue around suffrage.
Well, Eric is referring to the fact that I have the great privilege of being a producer of Suffs, the new musical that is on Broadway this season, and it is the story of the critical period between 1913 and 1920. In 1913, the suffragists waged the first ever protest march in Washington, D.C. To claim the right for women to vote, and it took 7 years, but finally the 19th Amendment was passed. And there's three quick things to say about it. One, the stories of these individual women, the choices they made, some of them had been fighting for suffrage for decades and were determined to play the inside game to convince, first people in states and then eventually the Congress to go ahead and put the amendment to be ratified out across the country. Some were young and too impatient to wait around for that process. And they were the ones who were on the front lines. They were the ones picketing Wilson's White House. They were the ones literally going to jail, being force-fed because they were on hunger strikes. And you could see the kind of, yin and yang of how change is made in a complicated country like ours. And you needed both. You need the people who would have tea with Wilson and keep pushing him, shaming him in a very polite and ladylike way. And then the people protesting him and holding up the signs that he was betraying democracy, fighting a war overseas, but not giving women the right to vote. So it's a very relevant story, because how do we make change today? But it's also relevant because the sacrifices that were made to get the right to vote, the legal right to vote, which then took, another 40 plus years to get the legislation to actually enforce it. And now, we're facing a consequential, some say existential election, and there are people who are bored by it or frustrated by it or uninterested in it. And I just want to say, go see this, go read history, find out why people were willing to sacrifice so much, the suffragists, the civil rights workers, and for heaven's sakes, show up and vote.
Thank you, Secretary Clinton. And congratulations to Simon & Schuster.
Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Anthony Doerr.
What's up, everybody? How's your stamina? There's only 23 writers left. After me, there will be a hologram of Edith Wharton. This is called A Rare and Significant Glimpse into a Day in the Life of a Pulitzer Prize-winning Novelist, brimming with never-before-revealed confessions, tawdry details, and shocking secrets. 7 a.m. exit bed, step on mouthguard, which writer has apparently ejected in his sleep. Why does the writer wear a mouthguard at night? Because the writer grinds his teeth. Why? Because the writer finds himself constructing another overly complicated novel involving characters who live in a time writer never lived and who do things like wind grandfather clocks and light whale oil lamps and other old-timey activities writer has never done. 7:02 let out dog. Upstairs from inside writer's laptop, the writer's novel yells, "You're dilly-dallying." Marilyn Robinson probably woke up at 5. 7:05 get dressed. The novel yells, "Nice sweatpants. You know Cheever put on a suit and tie to write, don't you?" 7:06 writer's iPhone on kitchen counter says, "Wanna know what preposterous new garbage Elon Musk said?" "Ignore that thing," says novel. "I've got a new recipe for minestrone," says iPhone. "It'll take 1 minute, 8 a.m. Novel says, "Now you've done it, you might as well fill a glass with gin right now." Nespresso machine on counter says, "2 espressos can salvage the day, so long as he doesn't check email," says novel. 8:01 check email. Blurb request, want our new t-shirt, softest ever, delete. Oh, that shirt does look soft, maybe that blue color. 8:35, dog says, "We should walk." Novel says, "Colson Whitehead has probably finished 3 chapters by now." Water bottle beside sink says, "Have you ever actually cleaned me?" 8:55, drink from newly cleaned water bottle. Novel says, "At 3 a.m. last night, you had an idea about the scene with the drunk clockmaker. Remember?" Dog says, "Are we doing this or what?" iPhone says, "It's probably time you figure out what book talk is all about." 10 a.m. Novel says, "In the 3 hours you've been awake, James Patterson has already published 2 books. iPhone says, "When you're in New York City on Monday, your mom wants you to get a selfie with Sanjay Gupta." 10:36, mindlessly devour 2 chocolate donuts while staring out window. Spend rest of morning reading about boot scrapers in 18th century Paris. Make 6 pages of notes about Parisian boot scrapers, even though novel currently contains no boot scraper characters. 1 p.m., pile of neglected mail says, you should probably open this Idaho gastroenterology envelope. 1:02 p.m., Google colonoscopy prep 64 ounces Gatorade whole bottle of Miralax, really, question mark? 1:04 p.m., take dog on long walk. 3 p.m., open laptop, invent new boot scraper character, insert boot scraper character into scene, have boot scraper character get drunk with clockmaker. 4:30 p.m., novel says, this new scene between the clockmaker and the boot scraper, we need to talk. iPhone says, GPT-4 can write an entire novel in like 4 seconds. 5 p.m., rewrite scene. 5:30 p.m., turn it back to the first version. 6 p.m., stomach says, wine? Novel says, stick with me 30 more minutes. From downstairs, Netflix says, there's a new season of Is It Cake? 9 p.m., writer says, tomorrow I'll try again. Novel says, we'll see about that. Thank you, everybody.
Please welcome one of the most distinguished and celebrated biographers and journalists of our time, Walter Isaacson.
Thank you very much. Ever since Max Simon and ever since Max Schuster and Richard Simon got into a car and drove themselves to Princeton, practicing Jewish jokes along the way in order to convince Albert Einstein to write a book for them, there's been something at the core of the fledgling publishing house that they created. And those are the editors. And so we end this evening celebrating one of the greatest in Simon & Schuster's history, an embodiment of the type of editor that made Simon & Schuster enduring, the indomitable, energetic Alice Mayhew. With a raspy laugh, an incisive mind, and her brutally honest margin notes. 40 years ago, when I was a young anonymous writer at Time magazine, my office mate and college friend, Evan Thomas, and I said, hey, let's write a book. It was sort of like, hey, let's put on the play. I'd been covering the Reagan campaign, and I noticed that when you went to rallies, you got the pamphlets from people about the establishment, about the Council on Foreign Relations and the Rockefellers and the Bilderberg Group. I was from Louisiana. I didn't know what they were talking about, but Evan was a preppy, and so I said, what is this establishment thing? So we spent a few days in a very tacky group house in Sag Harbor and came up with a complex chart that most editors would have totally dismissed as a book idea. A group biography of 6 very little-known statesmen who shaped the Cold War. I knew Binky Urban, who had just become an agent, and she says there's only one editor who will get what you're talking about. So we walked up Madison Street in Sag Harbor and sat on the back porch of Alice Mayhew. Just as we began our convoluted pitch, she cut us short. That's typical of her. She was always about 10 steps ahead of you. And she said, yes, I get it. It's a prequel to The Best and the Brightest, and we shall call it The Wise Men. As we were weaving the complex threads of 6 interacting characters, Alice would scribble in the margin in all caps, Atigta, all things in good time. Keep it chronological. Whenever you get stuck, remember the 6 magic words. Let me tell you a story. She was deeply informed by her lapsed religion, and she said, if chronological narrative is good enough for the Bible, it's good enough for you. The Bible, she always reminded us, had the best lead sentence ever. In the beginning, comma. I came to realize in the ensuing years that what Alice had done with us, and with the many others who took pride in being part of what we called Alice authors, was to create and build a special genre in American letters, the genre of narrative nonfiction, insider-informed books that were reported like journalism, but written like cinematic novels. It's a great contribution to American letters, and all of us who are Alice authors are honored to be a part. And there was, of course, one great pioneer, one grand exemplar of that genre, All the President's Men. And so it's my honor and great personal privilege to help close the show by presenting my friend, my mentor, and my fellow Alice author, Bob Woodward.
As Walter and other Alice authors would know, she would hate that we are doing this and talking about her. It would be the most disturbing event. But I think we really owe it to her and to the concept of tough editing. Alice was a tough cop. I remember it's 1973, so this is more than 50 years ago. Carl Bernstein and I had signed up to do a book with Simon Schuster about Watergate. The only problem was that was the point at which Watergate burst open, and there were literally almost every day 4 or 5 front-page stories in the Washington Post about Watergate. So we had in Adams Morgan at a Latin restaurant with Alice, we sat down with her and she said, "What are you going to do?" And we said, "Well, you know, this story's getting out of control." And we hemmed and hawed, and she pushed, and then she finally said, there's an important rule in writing, and that is write what you know best. And then she said, what you two know best is covering this story. Carl and I said, no, we want to write about the criminals in the Nixon White House. All of these people, and she said, no, you have no choice. You must write about yourselves. And it was necessity, and it was her insistence. There was no flexibility, no alternative. The story was out there. And so we agreed, and we started working on this manuscript. And by December 1973, we're holed up in the St. Regis Hotel here with Alice. We have this manuscript of reporting Watergate. It's really a reporting story. And we have typewriters, if you remember what those are. And Carl's typing away in one room, I'm typing in another room, and Alice comes up to me with a big sheaf of content from the book, about 90 pages. And she said, now this 90 pages, you need to cut 2. And cutting 2 out of 90? No problem at all. And she said, no, you cut the 90 pages down to 2. A painful moment. But she, of course, was right. And one of the things I did 19 books over 46 years with Alice. And she not only was an editor, she was a teacher. And the best editors are teachers. And you get a manuscript from Alice, and she would edit, she would change words or suggest things, but she would write. There are 3 words or phrases she would use. Tone, she'd just write tone, write sometimes pace, and then she would write not NEC, meaning not necessary. So first time, this is 50 years ago, get one of these manuscripts and tone. What do you mean? And she said, the tone's wrong. I said, well, how is it wrong? And she said, you figure it out. Then pace, you say pace here. And what does that mean? She said, the pace is wrong. You figure it out. Then she would write, not necessary. And I knew what that meant. And she was right, and she was wise. And it was this idea of handing the ball off to the writer. Truly a great editor. The other thing, seeing we're closing this off about Simon & Schuster, we are really fortunate, I know this personally, to have John Karp as the CEO of Simon & Schuster. I'm going to give you a real-time report about John. Yesterday, wasn't yesterday Sunday, when most people are not working? John was on the phone with me for an hour and a half. I'm working on a book that focuses on the wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East, and we're going through, and he is saying, you know, there are other things going on in the world, like Trump and the border, and he is making the case, you know, just be aware of those distant sounds of America and the world that affect us and impact us in such a way. And so I got a little defensive and said, well, no, wait a minute here. And so we exchanged emails. And I apologized a little bit and said, you know, you're right about some, but I'm going to push back on the rest of this. Now, this is not 2 weeks ago or 2 years ago. This is yesterday. And we finished our exchange of emails and our conversations, and I got an email from him, which I will post all of my life, remaining life, by the computer. And the email says, and yes, just so you have it in writing and in classic font, we are behind you no matter what. Now think of that. We are behind you no matter what. What does that mean? That means that the First Amendment is alive, Simon & Schuster is alive, Jonathan Karp is alive, and I'm tagging along at age 81. We are so lucky to have that. I mean, if you, I will not send out all the emails to everyone, or, but I mean, it was fierce and direct, but not personal, and we are behind you no matter what. Means write the effing book your way. Thank you.
So I guess we got to publish it. All right. Well, thank you, Walter and Bob. You and Alice Mayhew have helped us make history, and you'll always be an important part of our history. This concludes our celebration. I would like to thank all of the authors who shared their stories this evening. And so many more whose extraordinary books define the publishing program at Simon & Schuster as they have for 100 years. I'd also like to thank Town Hall for hosting us and Overland Entertainment for producing the event. It took a village of SNSers to put this show on tonight, and I'd like to thank everyone involved. And I'd especially like to thank Adam Rothberg, Susanna Lawrence, and Carrie Goldstein for the time that they put into curating this program. But most of all, on behalf of Simon & Schuster, I would like to thank you, the readers. Here's to another 100 years. Thank you, and good night.